Welcome to the public hearing for the inquiry into Budget Estimates 2021 for Families, Communities and Disability Services. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of land on which the Parliament is, and pay our collective respects to Elders past, present and emerging. I welcome today Minister Henskens and accompanying officials to this hearing. Today the committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolios of Families, Communities and Disability Services. Before I commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about today's proceedings. Today's proceedings are being broadcast live from Parliament's website. A transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. In accordance with broadcasting guidelines, media representatives are reminded to take responsibility about what they publish. All witnesses in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness according to a resolution of the House adopted in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness can only answer with certain documents to hand or with more time, and in those circumstances, witnesses are reminded they may take a question on notice and provide a written answer within 21 days. If witnesses wish to hand up documents, please do so through the committee staff. Minister, I remind you and the officers accompanying you that you're free to pass notes between you, and Minister, you're entitled to refer to your advisors seated at the table behind you as needed. In terms of audibility for today's hearing, we have witnesses in person and via video conference. So could I ask committee members to clearly identify who they are directing their questions to? And of course, those who are appearing remotely, I remind you to turn your microphones on before contributing, and it's best to turn it off after contributing as well. All witnesses will be sworn prior to giving evidence. Minister Henskens, I remind you that you are on your oath of office and do not require to be sworn.
My name's Henskens, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry?
Henskens? That's how you pronounce my name.
Yes.
Not
All
Henskens.
Right. Okay, sorry. Sorry, Minister. We'll just deal with Minister.
It's just pronounced how it's spelled.
Yeah. All right. Good. Yeah, for all other witnesses,
you know how it is.
I ask that you...
Mr. Muslim.
Yeah.
It's been here 10 years.
Yeah. I didn't mean any disrespect, Minister Henskens. Yeah. For all other witnesses, I ask that each in turn state your full name, position, title and agency, then take either an oath or an affirmation, copies of which are available in front of you. We might start with you, Ms. Delia.
I, Catherine Ann Delia, Acting Secretary for the Department of Communities and Justice. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. Ms. Check.
Thank you. Morning, committee members. My name's Simone Check, and I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Ms. Check. Mr. Vivers.
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Paul Vivers, Deputy Secretary, Department of Communities and Justice.
And on WebEx, Mr. O'Reilly.
Paul O'Reilly,
Thanks, Mr. O'Reilly. It might be best if you speak up. That came through very faintly, but we did hear you. Thank you. Ms. Campbell.
My name's Dan Campbell. I'm the Acting Deputy Secretary for Strategy, Policy and DCJ. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me truth and nothing.
Information superhighway.
Ms. Campbell, we missed a fair chunk of that, but I'll take you as having been sworn. But I might ask the Secretariat to work with you to try and improve the connection we have, because that will be inadequate for the purposes of the hearing. Yeah, so anyhow, we'll endeavour to deal with that. As there is no provision for opening statements, we will proceed directly with questioning from the opposition. The questioning will be divided between the opposition and the crossbench between 9:30 and 12:45 p.m. And then, of course, the government will have 15 minutes to clarify any matters at the end, should they wish. So I'll hand over to Ms. Jackson.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Minister Henskens, for coming along this morning. Wanted to start by asking about temporary accommodation. So how many households did DCJ support during the most recent lockdown with temporary accommodation?
I'm just seeing that my light is on. The number did fluctuate through the course of the recent lockdown.
What was the peak?
I believe it was about 2,000, but I'll defer to Mr. Vivers for the exact number.
It was exactly so, Minister, just above 2,000.
And Minister, or through you, Minister, to Mr. Vivers, do you have information about how many of those came from people sleeping rough, people escaping domestic violence? Do you have the breakdown of those figures, or would you need to take that on notice?
I can give you that breakdown. There were at its peak, roughly 400 people who were sleeping rough. At the beginning of this week, that number had reduced to around about 250.
Yep. What about women or children escaping domestic violence? Do you have that?
I'd have to take that on notice.
People who are Indigenous?
I'd have to take that on notice
and
too.
Those under 18?
There would be very few people under 18 in temporary accommodation. But I can take that on notice too.
So, Minister, we've heard that during the sort of peak of the lockdown, it was around 2,000 people, including 400 who had come from sleeping rough and were being accommodated in temporary accommodation. We've heard from Mr. Vivers that at the beginning of this week, that figure had dropped to 250. Where had the other 150 people gone?
Just bear with me. We have housed, just give you the figure during lockdown. So across the two lockdowns, we have housed 1,555 people sleeping rough. So that's going back to the first lockdown through till the end of September.
So how many of the 150 odd people who have left temporary accommodation between the peak of the most recent lockdown and the figure that you provided as of the beginning of this week have you housed?
I don't know that it's possible for me.
So
We would have to go back and check every single one of those people to find out. So I can give you the aggregate number of people who've been housed, but to track those individual 150 people, we would have to go back and examine the 150 cases to find out how many of them were directly housed by us and how many of them made their own arrangements or went to a specialist homelessness service or returned to family or friends.
The reality is that you don't know, do you, Minister? You don't know where those people are. It's quite possible and, in fact, probable that those people who were sleeping rough...
Well, are you going to ask a question or now give the speech?
...are now sleeping rough again, and you don't know where they are or what their housing situation is.
Well, I think Mr. Vivers has just indicated that that there are a range of different outcomes which they may have availed themselves of. People also leave temporary accommodation without informing the department of where they are going. So
you ask them where they're going?
Well, I'll defer to Mr. Vivers. I believe that sometimes they leave without us even knowing that they've left temporary accommodation, and we don't have that opportunity. But I'll defer to Mr. Vivers for more accurate information.
If I may say that at the last Estimates Committee, I made a commitment that we would undertake a piece of research. We did that. That research was published some time ago on our website. Since then, the Minister requested us to recommence that research, which we also did, and we started it again on Monday of this week. And what that research has consistently shown is that 89% of people who leave temporary accommodation go on to some other form of accommodation. Now, I don't say that that's permanent accommodation. Some is. Sometimes they go into specialist homelessness services, and many of them do resolve their own accommodation needs by returning to family. that still leaves far too many people. That still leaves 11% of people who do not go into permanent accommodation. That is far too big a number. It's a number we want very much to reduce. But if I can say that of the 250 people currently who were previously sleeping rough, currently in temporary accommodation, we actually have 500 places available in the Together Home programme. So we've got more than enough accommodation together with support services to accommodate those people, and that's what we're seeking to do.
And if I could add to that, our Together Home program is actually a leading national program in terms of dealing with homelessness. And the key point, it's a housing first approach. The key point of that program, which we've now invested over $120 million in, is to put people into a permanent accommodation solution and then give them the wraparound services to deal with the underlying causes of their homelessness, whether it be domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, and it is a program. It's in fact probably a world-leading program, which is actually designed to ensure that people permanently stay away from rough sleeping.
Together Home is a good program. I mean, I'm not sure it's world-leading. It's based on international best practice, which is good, and we've welcomed it. But the reality is 400 people who were previously sleeping rough were in temporary accommodation as of a few weeks ago. That number has dropped to 250. You're not able to tell us where those people have gone. They have not accessed.
So in aggregate, we are able to tell you that. I can tell you that, in aggregate, we can tell you how many people we have housed. If you're asking me those specific 150 people, we would have to look up the individual details of the 150 people. And in some cases, they will tell us where they're going, and in some cases they won't, but we seek to follow them all up. Roughly half of them, when we follow up, will not engage with us to tell us, and the other half is the survey, we've published the results of that.
But I think the important thing for the committee to understand with regard to this issue with regard to temporary accommodation is that our policy has not been to exit any person from temporary accommodation if they are engaging with the department to try and find a housing solution for them. That is our policy.
Is that your policy going forward?
And I have been very strict with Mr. Vivas that is to be our policy with regard to the people who entered temporary accommodation during the lockdown.
So that only applies to people who entered temporary accommodation during the lockdown. We're back to business as usual now, or if someone enters temporary accommodation now, the normal limits in terms of how long that accommodation lasts no longer apply?
It has always been the case and continues to be the case that if someone is at risk of sleeping rough, and obviously a key risk factor is that you were sleeping rough before, as long as people will engage with us, we keep them in temporary accommodation. That actually is the business as usual model. And to do anything else would be completely absurd because we invest massively in going out onto the streets to engage people who are sleeping rough. We do patrols at 4 o'clock in the morning, 11 o'clock at night, and we've done over 1,000 patrols during the lockdown period. So it would make no sense for us to exit people onto the streets if they were willing to engage with us, because we put such a massive effort in to getting onto the streets to bring them back into temporary accommodation.
But the requirements in relation to engaging with you are still turning up in person at a housing office, is that correct?
No.
How do you define engaging? How do you define whether someone is engaging with the department?
So people who are at risk of sleeping rough are engaged with a support service. In most cases, that's near my. And if they will work with that support service, so the support service will help them to find accommodation, they need to work with that support service if necessary to go and look at that accommodation would be an example. Or they may need to get some medical assessments in order for us to work out what's the right sort of accommodation. And if they will engage in doing that, we treat that as engagement and we'll keep working with them.
Minister, the Audit Office found that 72% of temporary accommodation clients supported during the 2020 lockdown had no known housing outcome. How are you going to ensure that that is not repeated in the 2021 lockdown? Because we already have hundreds of people leaving temporary accommodation.
Look, Ms Jackson, this is an issue of measurement and whether you put more resources into measurement or whether you use those resources to actually help the people that you're trying to measure. Now, we take the view that we did the survey that was done last year to give us a broad idea of what the accommodation outcomes were for people exiting temporary accommodation. But the cost of us actually investigating each and every person who is in temporary accommodation to have granular detail over the 72% that you're talking about is not actually a good use of public resources. The best use of public resources is actually to try and find accommodation solutions for these people, which I might add, in the annual street count of February of this year, showed a 13% statewide reduction in rough sleepers from the previous 12 months. In areas like Newcastle, 63%, Lake Macquarie 45%. City of Sydney was also better than that 13% state average. We have done an enormous amount of work and we are getting results in terms of reducing rough sleeping in this state. And the Together Home package is part of that. Huge number of resources, over $120 million devoted to getting permanent solutions for people who have been sleeping rough.
But you're not getting results because
well,
of
the 13%
the
reduction statewide is results, Ms Jackson.
Of the people that you spent millions of dollars housing during the 2020 lockdown, 72% of those had no known housing outcome. And your response to that is, oh, well, we think it's better than that, but we didn't invest in measurement, so we don't know.
Well, the survey... sorry, you go, Mr.
We precisely did invest in measurement.
So you do know, and that figure is
Well,
correct,
I'll take the
Mr.
point of
Beaver?
order. I'll take the point of order, Chair.
No, I understand the point of order.
Yeah.
Ms Jackson, I do think you need to allow the questions to be answered before the next question.
So at the last Estimates Committee, I gave a commitment that we would seek to measure what had happened to people who left temporary accommodation. And we've done that with that research company. We've done it for a subsequent period early in this lockdown, and we're doing it right now. And what that reveals is 34% of people who are in temporary accommodation went on to stay with family or friends. 20% of them went into private rental. 12% went into social housing and 15% went into a refuge. That's the 89% of people. Now, we are not complacent about the remaining 11%. With every single one of those remaining 11%, we have sought to get them into permanent accommodation, but we haven't always succeeded. We then seek to, if those people do return to sleeping rough, we then seek to try to pick them up and have another go. But those are people who have either breached temporary accommodation rules, so damage to property, or they have voluntarily left. We don't want people to leave temporary accommodation to go onto the streets. We want to house them.
I appreciate that you did the research that you committed to do, Mr. Vivers, and it is useful, but the Audit Office did its own research, and it found that during the period of the lockdown periods are important and useful because it is a specific time when the department, to its credit...
I'll take a point of order again. It's budget estimates. It's asking a question. It's not actually making a speech at a witness. So I would ask, Chair, that you direct...
To the point of order...
No, let me finish. You ask Ms Jackson to actually put a question. She's entitled to put a proposition. She's not entitled to make a speech.
Well, I've been listening carefully, and Ms Jackson is putting propositions and then asking a question about them. That is a legitimate way to put a question in budget estimates, and allow Ms Jackson to continue.
Yeah.
May I comment on the Audit Office? Because the Audit Office work was done before we had done this piece of research. So, of course, they didn't have access to it because of the timing of their audit.
So you just plainly reject their finding that 72% of people during the 2020 lockdown exited to no known housing outcome.
I don't reject their finding. They didn't have available to them the research that we did.
I just want to ask about the temporary accommodation budget before we move on. So what is the temporary accommodation budget for 2020, 2021? What was it?
It was 43 million.
That's
Sorry, 41.5 million, I beg your pardon.
and in 2019, 2020 it was 55 million. So you're telling me, Minister, that in the period between 2019 and 2020 to 2020, 2021, there was less need for a temporary accommodation to the order of $10 million or so?
Well, Mr. Vivers will explain.
Yeah. So the temporary accommodation budget is not in practice, I mean, that's the budget, but we put people in temporary accommodation when it's needed. And Treasury have topped up that budget for us to the tune of what it is needed to be. And this current year, the budget is 51.6 million because that's our projection of what we will need. Nobody is ever turned away from temporary accommodation for budget reasons. Not ever.
But so your suggestion is that there's just less need. We've gone from 2019, 2020, 55 million down to 40. Mr. Vivers, apologies. What was the figure? 41 million. Gone back up to 51. You're telling me that is just because less people needed temporary
I
accommodation?
think, Ms. Jackson, you are confusing the notion of a budget, which is a future estimate of expenditure, against what has actually been expended, if I understand Mr. Vivers' answer. And the reality is, as Mr. Vivers has said, whether that budget is exceeded or not, people are given temporary accommodation. There is no financial constraint on the provision of the services by the future estimate of how much may be a reasonable provision.
I see that the figure went up, Mr. Vivers, because it was 36 million. So I see the point that you're making, which is you felt as though you required additional funding and it was topped up to 41. But it does seem a bit odd that it went from 55 in a year in which there was only a period, a relatively short period at the end in which we were dealing with the impact of the lockdowns, to an over $10 million drop in the period 2020-2021. And that's just based on need? That just people didn't require nearly as much temporary accommodation in that period?
It was a future estimate, Ms. Jackson.
No, it is not, Minister.
Well,
that 41 million...
if I may say, the actual expenditure was 2 million more than that. So the budget you asked me was 41.5. The actual expenditure was 43.3 in that year. This year, the budget is 51.6. It is actually a demand-led budget, and in the first lockdown, the peak was over 2,200 and stayed at that rate for quite a while. In the second lockdown, there were just a few days when there were 2,000 people, and it dropped from there. But it's what we call a demand-led budget. The policy, no staff member refuses anybody temporary accommodation if they come within the policy.
Minister, how many dedicated specialist homeless services are there for women over 55 in New South Wales?
As to the number of the services, I think I would need...
Yes,
I think Ms.
Campbell.
Campbell is qualified to answer that.
Not very well.
I'm sorry, Ms. Campbell. That connection is just not going to be adequate. We get about 2 words in 3. We might have to just pause this question. We'll come back to it at a later point. One of the options might be if you turn your video off, and we'll see if we get a better audio stream. So, Ms. Campbell, I might just have the question. You're still aware of the question?
Yes, I am.
We'll try again, Ms. Campbell.
So in terms of women are in special sectors, we don't pay the benefits by totally wide range.
Not working.
Ms. Campbell, I'm sorry to cut across you again, but we're still getting only about 2 words in 3. We might see if you can work with the Secretariat over the next little bit to improve that connection, and we'll have to come back to that. I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson. Yep. Minister, how many children are currently in alternative care arrangements?
Mr. Shoebridge, that number fluctuates. I believe the most recent number is about 100.
So,
But I'll ask Ms. Check just to give the precise number.
so as of the 12th of October, there were 91 children in alternate care arrangements.
All right. And how does that compare to this time last year, Ms. Check?
Just refer to my notes, just bear with me for a minute. So if we go back to the 30th of September 2019, I know that's longer than 12 months, but there were 173 children in ACAs at that period. If I could take on notice from 12 months ago, I can provide that figure to the committee.
If you can, throughout the course of the morning, that would be
Sure.
good, Ms. Check. Of the 91 children in alternative care arrangements, how many of those are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children?
So of the 91 children at the 12th of October, 47% of those children are Aboriginal children.
So it's more than half now. Can you tell me what proportion of the children in alternative care were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? We'll start with your 30 September 2019 data, but then if you can also provide 12 months ago on notice.
I believe, I haven't got the actual figure, and again, I can come back to the committee during the course of this morning. I understand the proportion of Aboriginal children was about the same, but I'll confirm that number with the committee.
Ms. Check, do you agree that alternative care arrangements are effectively the last resort? It's the arrangement that you would never want to proactively put in place. These are children staying in motels or hotels.
The bulk of children in alternate care arrangements are there purely because of emergency situations where we haven't been able to locate a funded foster placement or a residential care placement. Approximately 40% of the children in ACAs at any given time are needing a residential placement, so that suggests, and indeed is the case, that their support needs are incredibly high, that mean they need a higher level of support. But it is only used in emergency circumstances and absolutely as a last option. And we also do everything we can to make sure that children exit those arrangements as quickly as possible. And indeed, almost 72% of the children in those arrangements in any given period do exit within a period of 90 days.
Well, the last time I asked about this, I was told that a child had been in alternative care for some 190 days. And in fact, the median was 55 days. It's an incredibly long period of time for a child to be without any kind of parenting figure in a motel. Can you tell me what the longest stay is at the moment, or the most recent data you have? What's the longest that a child who's still in alternative care or was at the 12th of October has been in alternative care?
Sure. So as at the 12th of October, the longest stay child has been in that arrangement just over 300 days. Clearly unacceptable. In my view, 1 day is too long. That particular child, who is 12 years of age, has some quite complex needs, was to return home. Those plans changed, unfortunately, just recently, which has delayed his exit from the ACA.
Is that child Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander?
Yes.
Ms. Check, also, Minister, are you still getting monthly reports about what's happening in alternative care arrangements?
I actually get weekly reports.
How do you explain that a 12-year-old child, now 12, has been 300 days basically living in a motel under your care?
Mr. Shoebridge, I share your concerns about this issue. I have made it a weekly item on the agenda of my meetings with the executive of the department, and they regularly give me briefings on strategies to exit particularly the longer term children out of ACA. I think Ms. Check has already said that many of these children have very complex needs, and it's very difficult to arrange a foster parenting or other type of accommodation solution for them. One of the initiatives that I've asked them to do, which is currently in place, is to actually provide a different model for these children with a more complex needs, to which Ms. Check could speak to. But that is underway, that work is underway, and I hope to implement that soon.
But Minister, a 12-year-old child has been 300 days basically in a motel, probably moving from motel to motel with no permanent home, no permanent carer. It's an almost impossible burden for that child to ever overcome. And I can't understand how it's 300 days, Minister. I can't. Did Ms. Check, do you have an explanation?
So that young person is in a serviced apartment, and again, I'm not advocating for that type of arrangement. He has a core support team, so that team does not change. So he's not moving, as you describe, on a regular basis from hotel or serviced apartment to serviced apartment. He has a core staff that works with him. Again, not ideal for any 12-year-old, but at least it's some consistency while we work to the longer term option for that young boy.
Staff rotate in on a 24-hour roster.
That's correct.
He doesn't have a parent figure, doesn't have a carer figure, just has staff rotating in and out through the service department for 300 days. It seems a breach of the duty of care, Minister, over that young person's welfare. What do you say?
Mr. Shoebridge, I share your concerns. I have been working with the department. As you would appreciate, I've only been in the job for a relatively short amount of time, but this is certainly one of the issues that I have prioritised to improve. We are working on a better model for these children, particularly the long-term children, because I agree with you, it is unacceptable.
Ms. Check, what is the median stay that children have in alternate care?
The median stay is 6 weeks.
So it's 42 days?
For medium length of stay, 41 days.
41 days. Is it the absence of sufficient residential care facilities that has that is the sticking point here?
There are a range of factors that contribute to this situation. So there's a proportion of children in ACAs who should be in foster care, and foster carers generally are in short supply. Typically, children that are in ACAs are a little bit older. Unfortunately, most foster carers don't want to care for an older child, particularly children who might have some more complex needs. As the Minister mentioned, we have currently in procurement, so I'm limited in what I can say, another model that will come onto line later in the year, which is a short-term emergency placement model, and that is for children who have more medium and high support needs. It's similar to residential care. I think it'd be remiss of me not to say that there are some children, particularly older children, that do need to go into a residential care model that has a therapeutic intervention, because that's how they recover from trauma. But obviously in an ACA, those things can't happen in the way we would like them to.
So, and indeed, in fact, it's like warehousing children, often who've come from deeply traumatic experiences, and they're just literally warehoused, in this case, for 300 days. What kind of outreach is being provided? What trauma care is being provided for children in alternative care?
We have a range of support services that are provided to children, and that'll vary on a case-by-case basis depending on the needs of a particular child. We have an internal program, which is the Links Trauma Healing Program, which has been incredibly successful, providing support to children in ACAs to help them recover from trauma and provide support quite intensively in those placements. But we also lean on our colleagues in health and mental health, again, depending on the circumstances of the child and the needs. And we also have our own psychologists that are able to provide support as needed, particularly around the writing and implementation of behavioural support plans.
Ms. Check, what is the rate at which children in alternative care arrangements attend school? How much school are they missing?
My understanding, Mr. Shoebridge, is the majority of children are either attending school or in some cases they've been excluded from school because of their behaviour. And in those cases, those children are undertaking homeschooling. The actual figures, if we could take that on notice, we can provide those to the committee.
You see, a child in alternative care arrangements who's been excluded from school and not attending school is literally 24 hours a day in a motel or 24 hours a day in a serviced apartment with no interaction with family members and no interaction with peers. That's why I'm asking you about this, Ms. Chegg.
Yeah, like I said, we'll provide the numbers for the committee's information. Again, on a case-by-case basis, children will have usually a weekly activity that they're activity sheet that they're involved in putting together. It doesn't mean that they stay in that premises 24/7. They're often out engaging in either therapy or other activities in the community. But again, it'll vary child to child.
If you're 12 years old and your outing for the week from your alternative care arrangement is to go and see your therapist, then the state's failing you, isn't it, Ms. Check?
Like I said, there'll be a range of activities during the week. It could be therapy sessions. And these children, you know, they have experienced quite significant trauma. That means they do need to engage in those services, again, on an as-needed basis. But there's a range of other activities that they will engage in. Many of them are involved in sporting clubs. Like I was only looking at a little boy the other day who he had been playing soccer prior to COVID, but was keen to, hopefully with the restrictions easing, enter into the cricket season in the next few weeks.
There's one child in alternative care who may be going to cricket at some point. It's not really an answer to the issue, Ms. Check.
No, sorry. That was just an example, Mr. Shoebridge. But my point is children, again, they'll vary from one child to the next, but they do have a range of activities they undertake during the week.
Ms. Check, I'll just be quite clear. I'm not persuaded that in any way that's even close to adequate for a child. And I'm suggesting you don't believe that either. Is that right?
Well, I think, Mr. Shoebridge, if I may say, Ms. Check has explained that the welfare of these children are being monitored by professional experts, far more expert than you or I, who have devised a plan for them which is in their best interest, which includes sport and other activities. You've tried to characterise it, quite unfairly and inconsistent with the evidence of the witness, as merely going to see their psychologists, when in fact she's explained to you that they engage in a range of community activities on the advice of professionals. Now, is it an ideal situation? No, it's not. But I don't think you should misrepresent what the evidence was of the witness.
Ms. Check, is that your evidence? That these children in alternative care are having on a weekly basis, regular social activities scheduled regular social and sporting activities. Is that your evidence? That's what the minister says your evidence is. Is that your evidence?
So, like I said, on a case-by-case basis, it'll vary, but children do engage in a range of activities through the week. I know that because, like the minister, I am reviewing the circumstances of children each week, sometimes more frequently, as are my colleagues in each of the districts through regular what we call panels. To not only expedite the exit of those children to a funded placement, but to make sure that they are engaging in whether it's therapy or any other activities.
Minister, have you spoken with parents who have had their children returned to them from alternative care arrangements and heard from them what the experiences of their family were? Have you had the chat with parents who finally had their kids come back from 6 months in alternative care, 3 months in alternative care, and actually heard firsthand what the experiences are? I have. Have you?
Look, Mr. Shibridge, I agree with you that this is not a desirable outcome for young people. That is why I have been working with the department to reduce the number of days that these children are in this type of care.
Well, Minister, I ask you, have you spoken with the parents who finally had their children come back from alternative care and heard about what the actual experience is? Not through Ms. Check, but directly from the parents. I have, and I can tell you now, this discussion about social events and sporting events and social activities is not the experience that's been reported to me.
Well, it's obviously
What's the
got to be
experience that's been reported
it's obviously
to you?
got to be appropriate to the child.
Are you willing to meet with parents if they want to reach out with you to hear their family's experience?
Of course I am.
All right. Well, I think you'll be taken up on that, Minister. And I'm grateful for your willingness to do that. I think it's important. Minister, what proportion of the New South Wales Child Protection and Out-of-Home Care budget is directed to prevention and early intervention? And by that, I'm including family support and restoration services.
So $2.5 billion is committed towards the safety and welfare of vulnerable children. You're asking in respect of, particularly in respect of early intervention?
Well, I'm really seeking, of that $2.5 billion,
Yep.
how much is spent on statutory out-of-home care services, like the removal process, as opposed to how much is spent on prevention and early intervention?
Well,
The June report
Yeah.
has made a series of caustic observations about it in the past. I'm asking what the state is now.
In this year's budget, if I can just give you the breakdown of various different expenditures, $756.5 million has been invested in statutory child protection interventions and assessment of child abuse and neglect, and supports to keep children safely at home, preventing entries to out-of-home care. $164.2 million is invested in targeted early intervention services that support children, young people, families and communities experiencing or at risk of vulnerability.
So out of a 2.5...
$1.4 billion is to fund out-of-home care and permanency programs.
So out of a $2.5 billion budget, $164 million is targeted to early intervention. Is that right?
Well, no, because part of the $756.5 million, I think, supports statutory child protection interventions, as well, an assessment of child abuse. I'm not sure of the complete.
Assessing child abuse is not early intervention. That's not directed at helping families. What of the $756 million would be categorised as prevention and early intervention?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the proposition that you made with regard to that first amount, because when the statutory child protection system comes into place or intervenes, the last resort is for children to go into out-of-home care. The principal objective is to work with the families to ensure that that outcome doesn't occur. So I'm not sure.
Well, I'm asking you.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with you that you can discount all of that $756 million.
Well, I'm asking you, of that $756.5 million, how much is actually being spent on helping families? Money to support families, money to prevent children being removed. How much of the $756 million in that statutory child protection bucket is actually being spent to help families?
If I
Yes.
could make a contribution, so of that money, the 700 million, it in part funds 2,333 caseworkers. Last financial year, we completed more than 36,000 risk assessments. A very small proportion of those risk assessments meant that children actually came into care. So I'd have to check my notes for the actual figure, but it was around the 2,400 mark from memory. So you could argue that the remainder, on balance, again, depending on need and the outcome of a risk assessment, but that families were supported, not only to mitigate the risks that might have been presenting, but to provide ongoing support to families.
Well, I'm asking you, what ongoing support is being provided to families? How much of the $756 million has been allocated not to paying for caseworkers, not for paying for the assessment inside the department and employee costs? I'm asking, and it should be a fairly straightforward question and answer, how much of the $756 million has been spent on early intervention and supporting families?
Well, I think we would need to cost. We can probably take it on notice, but we would need to cost services like Brighter Futures, Youth Hope, intensive family preservation and multi-system therapy and so on. There are a range of programs that are included within that $756.5 million number. We could cost those, perhaps to give you the more granular detail that you seem to be after.
Well, it's not just me, and I'll hand over the opposition at this point, but pretty much everybody engaged in this space wants to know how much is being spent on removing kids and how much is being spent on supporting families. And we're at budget estimates and we don't seem to have that most basic data.
Well, take it on notice, Dave.
Well, we're entitled to ask the next round of questions.
Indeed. So, Ms.
Chair, before we start the next round, we've got these witnesses appearing by teleconference. I'll just do a...
Who have we got?
And Campbell.
All right, but I can see Ms. Campbell there.
Yeah, we're doing a combination of sound by
All right.
teleconference and visual by web.
Well, I think they're both, aren't they? 'Cause that's still...
Just bear with me a sec. Oh, Ms. Campbell, let's try it again. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me now?
I can. So that's actually coming through loud and clear.
We're not complaining.
And Mr. O'Reilly.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can. You two are coming through more clearly than the minister. I'll hand back over to the opposition.
Good morning, Minister. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today here and online. I want to start with some questions about the management of COVID in juvenile justice. Who is responsible for the management of COVID planning in youth justice centres?
Without going to Mr. O'Reilly, who has more details, it's a combination of DCJ on advice from health. Mr. O'Reilly, is that correct?
So I'm responsible for the COVID-19 response in youth justice, and I undertake with my team a rolling series of risk assessments to inform all of our decisions, and we take input from a range of people, mainly health, justice health, public health team. We've also consulted at various points with the Clinical Excellence Commission. We also confront our frontline staff, our clients. The PSA are incredibly helpful in working alongside us to assess risk, and we draw on expertise depending on the question that we're asking.
Thanks. So that's quite a wide range of...
I think we're going to have to be to both both witnesses who are on the phone. We're going to have to be quite vigilant about muting. even when you're being asked questions, if you possibly can. So, good luck.
Only to me, I think. But can you talk to me about the role that Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health have played in planning and also advice as the outbreak over the last couple of months was happening?
Yes, your voice is quite faint, but I think you asked me the role of Justice Health.
Yes.
In planning and responding, etc. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yep. Okay. So we work very closely with Justice Health. There are Justice Health staff embedded in each of our 6 centres, and they work alongside the centre management team on day-to-day responses. But there is also an overarching approach where my senior team pulls together a business continuity plan in response to any major incident, whether it's bushfires or whatever. And in this case, it was response to a pandemic. And not only is Justice Health consulted in the development of that plan, but they have an overview before it comes to me for sign-off, and I might discuss elements of it. We also work alongside my Executive Director counterpart in Justice Health so that we can plan together. For example, as soon as the vaccines became available, we planned a series of vaccination clinics in the centre that was planned between myself and my counterpart in Justice Health, and then it was administered by the nursing unit managers in each of the centres. It really is a partnership where we work together on each of the questions, and we try and be available to each other 24/7 to answer any questions and try and get ahead of the risk as much as we possibly can.
Thanks. And so that's useful in terms of how you planned for the risk, but of course COVID did make its way into your service. What was the process put in place to manage any positive cases? So you can talk about the positive cases that were found in the centre. Did that come in from outside? What was the process for managing kids as they came into the system, particularly in relation to COVID?
Would you like me to speak to that?
Yes, sure.
So at a fairly early point in time, and Mr. O'Reilly can give details, there was compulsory rapid antigen testing for anybody that came within our facilities. With regard to new detainees, they came in and they were quarantined and then given a PCR test. If the PCR test indicated that they were positive, then they remained in quarantine and segregated from the rest of the population in the detention centres. Then there's been a vaccination rollout with regard to both the detainees and also the staff. But Mr. O'Reilly may wish to add any detail that I've left out to that.
Well, I mean, I will ask about both of those things in a little bit more detail. But in terms of the rapid testing, when did that start? So that was after you had cases inside of the system.
No,
correct?
I think it predated them, but Mr. O'Reilly can just correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah. Our first case was on the 5th of August, and rapid testing started after that. We have to wait until the testing. Sorry about this.
Sorry, Mr. O'Reilly, but need to try that again.
Mr. O'Reilly, I think you've definitely put your computer on mute if you've got the phone happening, but we'll try again.
The computer is on mute, I can promise you. We'll see if that's any better.
Better.
Yep.
Is that better?
Yes.
It is.
Okay, I can't hear you now, but I'm just going to do my best. So the first case in custody was the 5th of August, and rapid antigen testing started after that. We had to wait until the regulator approved rapid antigen screening in New South Wales, and then the minute it was approved, we commenced alongside corrective services, and that was led by Justice Health and by us. So rapid antigen screening is now in place in all of our centres and all of our children's court locations that we control, where we control access to children's court for our clients. So that process is underway now. We've had a range of things in place to protect the system and protect people from COVID-19 coming into the system since early 2020 when it started, including ceasing of social visits and family visits, and we started them up again between the outbreaks, but then we closed them again. That is to minimise the risk of it coming in. We've also had temperature testing in our centres since the beginning of the first outbreak, We've also had screening in terms of questions about where people have been. We've had QR codes in place as soon as they become available from Service New South Wales. And we've also been vigilant about asking people if they have any symptoms and not allowing them to stay at work if they have, and utilising special COVID leave so that people who are casual don't have a perverse incentive to come to work if they are sick. So we've been really careful to make sure that people are not coming to work if they're unwell.
So,
when people are admitted to custody, we talk to the police when they bring people in to test whether they have any information that might be relevant to COVID screening. And then when they come into custody, they are screened by the Justice Health person as part of the admissions process and put into quarantine for 14 days and tested for COVID-19. If they have symptoms or if they are COVID-19 positive, they go into a different kind of quarantine called medical isolation, which is a different kind of quarantine, far more strict, but within the regulations, of course. And they have very careful medical supervision for the duration until they clear up their symptoms and test negative for COVID-19. Rapid antigen screening has been used in the centres for a few weeks now to screen all staff and everybody else. People are waving, I can't hear.
I think we should. I think it's particularly difficult for Mr. O'Reilly, and I'm appreciating his engagement. Mr. O'Reilly.
Can he hear?
I can see you nodding. Thanks for that. So the arrangement you're going to put in place is turn your volume up until you're speaking, and then you're going to turn your volume down. And we will keep that in mind.
Mr. Chair, sorry, could I just first of all apologise that I was wrong as to the chronology with regard to rapid antigen testing. But Ms. Moriarty, the first case within a detention centre, we certainly did have that arrangement with regard to quarantining new detainees coming into the detention centres. And in fact, the first case was in quarantine within the detention centre when they tested positive with a PCR test.
Yeah.
So they had been segregated from the prison population.
Yeah, and so clearly that's where I'm headed with this, right? I am critical of the fact that thank you, Mr. O'Reilly, that you've outlined some processes that have been in place after COVID got in, and I know you've had some processes in place since last year.
My point. My point is that as Mr. O'Reilly described, the rapid antigen testing had not been approved for use prior to that first case. However, we had ceased any external visits, and there was strong biosecurity procedures in place, not including rapid antigen testing, with regard to staff and anyone else coming within the prison environment. And in addition to that, new additions into the detention centres who have obviously come from out in the community that we couldn't control were put in a quarantine situation, tested with a PCR. If they tested positive, as the first case did, they remained in quarantine and did not interact with the rest of the prison population.
But again, so PCR testing wasn't until after the cases got in. Now, PCR testing is something that has been approved until later.
That's not correct.
Okay, so when did you start it?
PCR started as soon as it became available last year.
Okay, sorry, I should be referring to the rapid testing, which
the
also
first
changed.
case,
It doesn't matter, it's not the point.
The first case was PCR tested while they were in quarantine. The test came in, Mr. O'Reilly will correct me, within 24 hours or so of that person being put in a quarantine part of the detention centre, and he remained in quarantine and did not interact with the rest of the population of that centre for 14 days. I think he may have actually exited the centre within the 14 days, but anyway, he didn't have interaction with the rest of the population.
Can I ask about, so there are cases with staff working in the system, and in fact, one of the employees in the system died. I want to be very careful about raising that, and I'm very sorry for his family and for the people who worked with him. It's a tragedy. But how many cases were there for your staff in youth justice, in addition to him?
I think it's that.
Whoever you like.
I think I'll cut to Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay. Firstly, the person who's deceased, I spoke with his family and they found public discussion with it. It's very distressing. I will just point out that he wasn't in our centres and he did not contribute to the workplace. in our system, and it's a very private and sensitive term, so I would rather not discuss that. That's 13 staff contract COVID-19, and 3 of those staff COVID-19 in the workplace. Of the 13 people, 19, 3 in the workplace, 1 is deceased, as I mentioned, the other 12 have recovered. 28 young people have been tested positive to COVID-19. 2 of those 28 in our system. Of the 28 who 19, 3 currently in custody and in the other 25 have recovered and are discharged.
Mr. O'Reilly, sorry, just as the chair here, you are coming through in quite a broken way because you're no longer coming through the telephone link.
Could I just give the numbers that I think he gave,
so
just for the benefit of the committee?
Yes, that's what we need.
And Mr. O'Reilly can hear this and he can correct anything if I've misunderstood him. 13 of the 1,380 years justice staff have tested positive. That includes, unfortunately, the one gentleman who's deceased, who did not become infected within the prison environment. Of the other 12 staff members, they have all recovered from their illness. There are 28 people, young people in the youth justice who have tested positive. 3 of those only, I believe Mr. O'Reilly said, contracted it within the youth justice environment. I believe that, I think he said that 25 have now recovered and that there are 3 that are still sick, but I may have misunderstood that, Mr. O'Reilly.
I'm back on the phone now. Is that any better?
A lot.
Yes, but you're unfortunately coming through both. But yes, we will fire away.
My computer link is on mute.
Yep, good now. Good now.
Every time I say
Okay, shall I have a go?
Yes.
You've got to have a go to get a go.
Yes, so the minister's numbers are largely correct. 28 young people have tested positive. 2 of those contracted COVID-19 in our care, and the other 26 did not. Currently in custody, we have 3 young people who are infectious with COVID-19, and they're in medical isolation, obviously. The other 25 have recovered and or are discharged from custody through bail.
How many of the young people who contracted COVID were hospitalised?
1 was hospitalised, the very first one, in fact.
And how were the others? How was their care managed while they were in detention?
They were managed in medical isolation and supervised by Justice Health, and it's just a question of monitoring their condition on a regular basis. For example, I can't speak for health, but monitoring blood oxygen levels is one of the most important things, and so there are techniques arranged for that, and they are just overseen very carefully by staff who obviously are trained to do so and have head-to-toe PPE. At Cobham Youth Justice Centre, we've established a COVID unit where COVID-positive young people are held, and that unit is set up especially to manage COVID-positive people. It's very secure, very well organised. I've visited that centre myself and visited the young people and staff in there who have COVID, and the young people who have COVID, and it's a very calm, supportive environment to make sure that they are able to recover as quickly as possible, and they have access to legal support so they can make their bail applications as appropriate.
Thanks. And just a final question in this round. So thank you for the breakdown in terms of the staff. And I'm very mindful that in terms of the person who died, that it's very sensitive. I don't want to intrude, but it is still relevant and there is public interest around it. I understand your evidence that it wasn't contracted at work, but is it being treated as a workplace situation?
No, it's not. It's not a workplace situation. The person contracted COVID-19 in the community and they didn't come into work while they were infectious. And that's all I'm prepared to say on that matter, to be frank, because, again, I've spoken with the family and they find public discussion about this extremely distressing, and I don't want to be party to discussion about that.
Well, I don't want to be insensitive about it, but it is. I am going to ask about it. So it's not being treated as a workers' comp insurance type situation from the perspective of your organisation? Okay. So can I just turn to vaccinations? Because like in corrections proper, I understand that you've rolled it out now, but it was too slow. So what is the status now, first of all, in terms of staff? What's the breakdown for people who are either partially or fully vaccinated?
Everybody working in frontline youth justice has at least one vaccination. That's a requirement since 25th of October, and 85% have two doses, and by the 17th of January, all will have 2 doses. That's the staff breakdown.
So everyone,
Young people in custody.
All staff have had 1 dose, or are there people who, because I know it's compulsory, it was from when was that, the 25th, I think,
25th.
Or correct me?
25th of October.
So are there any that have not, or are there any who might be on leave because they haven't been vaccinated?
There would be a small number, but they're not working in frontline youth justice currently because they would be on leave because they're not allowed to work in youth justice frontline without at least 1 jab.
Sure. So I want to ask about the circumstances around that. So what is the number of staff who have not had any vaccination at this point?
Yeah, it's approximately 20, but I'll come back to you with the exact number because it does change each day. There are people who would not have been vaccinated on the 25th of October, but will have arranged their vaccination since then. So we'll take on notice the exact number who are not quite compliant, but also I can assure you they're not working at the moment.
Yeah, so, but I want to know about the long-term planning for that. So out of that roughly 20, and I accept that you'll come back with the specifics, are they, have they made appointments, or what are the arrangements going to be in place if they are refusing to do it?
Well, it varies. There are some people who have made appointments. There are some people who are seeking a medical exemption and haven't managed to put it in place yet. And there are some people who have made a decision not to get vaccinated. And they will need to make a choice about whether they take their leave and reflect and change their mind, or whether they leave the service.
And what's the timeline for that? Look, I understand this is an issue everywhere, but you don't have a massive amount of staff, and so even 20 will have an impact in terms of the work that's done. So the date was the 21st or the 25th, whatever the compulsory date was. What is the timeline for resolving this?
We need to do as quickly as possible because it's urgent, but they are individual circumstances, and I can't predict how long it will take. But I can assure you there are 1,200 operational staff, and there's no impact on service continuity as a result of this, because the numbers of non-compliant people are small compared to the overall staff, which is around 1,200 operational staff.
And what about the...
And mandatory vaccination is with the full support of the unions too.
I support it too, but I still need to ask some questions about what the logistics will be for people who aren't doing it. It's a question across government.
Who are normally off with the flu.
Sure. Well, relevant questions. I have the answer. Thank you. In terms of the young people who are in detention, what's the vaccination rate?
At the end. I was just making a statement as opposed to asking a question.
So, order.
I think I heard the question was about the vaccination rates for young people in custody. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, so we currently have 70% of young people in custody have 1 dose and 56% have 2 doses. It has been higher than that, but what happens is people who are vaccinated are then discharged from custody, and because we only have 172 people in custody, 10 people discharged who are vaccinated does impact the percentages, but we're satisfied that we're doing all we can. We've had a vaccination scheme in place since the vaccination was approved by the regulator. For many months, people under 18 and under 16 were not eligible, so lots of kids in custody were not eligible. But once it was eligible for everybody from 12 up, our numbers of vaccinated kids really shot up. And so we've had it as high as 78%, we've had it as high as 95% for Aboriginal young people in custody. But again, as people are discharged, the percentages drop. It's a very unstable population. But what we do now is 14 days quarantine for every admission, and they are offered a vaccination at the beginning and the middle and the end of that 14-day period. And during that period, most young people accept the offer and receive a vaccination dose.
Mr. O'Reilly, I'm endeavouring to be a poorly qualified IT support person, but the advice we have from the Secretariat is that it might be best to listen through your phone, put your phone on speaker if at all possible, and entirely engage in terms of the voice and sound through the phone. Yep. Thanks. Minister, how many children between the ages of 10 to 13 are in jail?
At one point, I did know that there were no people between the ages of 10 and 12 in jail. I'm not sure of 13. I am aware that there are some inmates or detainees who are 13. I'm not sure if Mr. O'Reilly knows the number.
Mr. O'Reilly?
There are 3 people under 14 in custody today.
And over the course of the last 12 months, how many children aged 10 to 13 have been in custody?
The average per day is 5 over the last 12 months, and the same over the previous 12 months.
Yeah. But so how many individual children aged 10 to 13 have been held in custody, held in jail over the last 12 months? Is that right?
That would require a bit of analysis, which we can take on notice, because there are some who have come in multiple times. So in terms of how many individuals, we'd have to do some work on that and come back to you.
Would you know what the average length of stay, the average length of detention is for children aged 10 to 13?
Not off the top of my head. The vast majority are on remand, as you would expect, but we don't know right now what the average number of days is, but that is a piece of analysis we can do quickly. All right. And come back to you within the 21 days.
And Mr. O'Reilly, you've jumped to my next question, which is what proportion are on remand and what proportion are sentenced?
Yeah, of the 3, my understanding is 1 is on a control order and 2 are on remand.
All right. And could you, if you could possibly give us the analysis over the last 12 months as well? On remand.
Certainly.
Thanks. How many children are there in detention last night, if you've got the data, or the most current data?
I think the number that
172.
Yes.
172. And breaking that figure down, how many of those are on remand, having not been convicted?
109 of those are on remand.
And of the children, of those 109, how many are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander?
42%, so 45 of the 109 young people on remand are Aboriginal young people.
And of the 172?
76 are Aboriginal.
Have you done
44%?
44%. What is the principal reason, Mr. O'Reilly, if you're aware of it, why children are being held on remand? Is it risk of flight, or is it inadequate housing options? What's the principal reason?
I think 2 of the 13-year-olds are on remand for murder.
I would say there are a range of reasons.
Yep.
And one of the most the challenging, I'm happy to answer the question and I will answer it in full, of course, but I just wanted to also add that a lot of this relates to decisions of police and courts, and I can't speak for those agencies. But we do work closely with them, and we do look at the data because it is very important to us. Previous history of bail breaches and an assessment of risk by the bail decision maker are the primary reasons why bail is refused. This morning, when I checked the data, there were no Section 28 bail people on remand. In other words, there were no people on remand for the only reason being they couldn't have accommodation. But that is not always the case. Sometimes there are a number in custody who are in custody for that reason, but today there happens to be none. But the number of people who are in custody just because of accommodation is low. But again, we also have a low number of people in custody.
Yeah.
Full stop. But it is low.
So
generally speaking, it's history of bail breaches that is the problem.
Yeah.
You will note, Mr. Chair, that there are over 400 people in youth detention when this coalition government came to power, and it's now 172, a reduction of over 50%.
Minister, I think it's been one of the genuine achievements in youth justice, the reduction in number of children in detention. And I was actually just going to ask Mr. O'Reilly about Section 28 and the Bail Act reforms. Mr. O'Reilly, those appear to actually be working. The ability to apply to the registrar without returning to court if accommodation options have been found. How is that working in practice?
It works reasonably well. Certainly our bail teams and our casework teams work incredibly hard and incredibly closely with the registrar of the Children's Court. and also with Legal Aid and Aboriginal Legal Service to put together viable bail plans, bail support plans for young people. Accommodation is usually a part of that, but it is usually not the only part. And it really depends on the capacity of people like family to provide the right mix of corrective, protective factors to make that bail plan viable. But yeah, I think it's a good partnership, if you like, of our staff, the court, and the legal representatives to pull together the plan to keep the young person out of custody, because we know that that is not the best place to undertake rehabilitation. And in relation to bail, charges haven't even been proven. So we want people out of custody and putting supports in place and working on getting reconnected with school and family. That's what we want it to be.
Are there arrangements in place, particularly for Aboriginal kids, to have more than one address for bail, noting they often move amongst family members where the support's available? Are those arrangements currently in place?
Wherever possible, but it's probably a better question for Legal Aid and the Aboriginal Legal Service who represent those kids and put those matters forward. But certainly one of the things my team do is they certainly engage in family finding and searching for options for young people. That is part of their core business in terms of supporting bail plans wherever possible to put as many options into the mix as possible.
Moving to a different point, Minister, how many children are in out-of-home care at the moment? And again, the most recent data you have.
Yes. I'll just ask Ms. Check just to give the absolute most up-to-date number.
As at the 30th of June this year, there were 15,895 children in out-of-home care.
15,000?
895.
All right. And how does that compare to 30th of June last year?
So 30th of June last year, 2020, 16,160.
All right. Of the 15,895 children in out-of-home care, how many of those children are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander?
Yes, so for 2021, so again 30th of June, 6,829, 43% of the 15,895 are Aboriginal.
And last year?
6,688, 41.4% of 16,160.
Minister, while the overall number of children in out-of-home care has reduced, the absolute number of Aboriginal children being taken and put in out-of-home care has increased, and the proportion of the young people who are Aboriginal has increased. How do you explain that?
Look, the numbers have changed. It hasn't been a great change. I would suggest that neither number is acceptable and that there needs to be less Indigenous children in out-of-home care.
Is that the answer?
If I could add, some of the increase, Mr. Shoebridge, we have seen in the last financial year a slight increase in Aboriginal entries to care. So that increase compared to last year was an increase of just over 2%. There's also been a decrease in the number of exits. So when we say exits, and I'm sure the committee is aware of this, but what we mean by that is whether children have returned home, so a restoration, a guardianship order or an open adoption order. We don't count as an exit children leaving care, but we have seen a slight decrease in the number of children exiting, particularly as it relates to restoration over the last 12 months.
Minister, those figures for me are quite shocking. I can't work out the exact number, but it would suggest, and I don't know if you have a data, that Aboriginal kids are in the order of 15 to 20 times more likely to be taken and put in care than a non-Aboriginal child. Do you have the data?
I don't think that is the correct numbers. I don't think that's the correct numbers, but it's too high. I'm not going to argue around the actual figures. It's too high.
I've just done the
It's
numbers.
not
It's
acceptable.
16 times more likely. 16 times more likely. An Aboriginal child is 16 times more likely to be taken from family, taken from country, and put in statutory out-of-home care than their non-Aboriginal counterpart. That's the analysis I have on those numbers. That is a damning indictment on the system, isn't it, Minister?
It's not acceptable. That's why we obviously we commissioned the Family's Culture Report, and we've started. We've substantially down the track to implementing its recommendations.
Minister, your government has refused to even look at the statutory reforms recommended in the Family's Culture Report, refused to even look at them until 2024. And we're seeing the results now with these figures, aren't we?
But Mr. Shoebridge, the government has either completed or is in the process of completing 94 of the 125 recommendations, as you know. The only recommendations that have not commenced to be implemented relate to the statutory or the proposed statutory changes, which the government had said it would do in 2024 when it does its usual statutory review of the legislation. And the reason for that decision is to implement the other reports so that any statutory changes, implement the other recommendations and have some data on how those other recommendations are tracking before statutory changes are considered.
Minister, Professor Davies said the statutory amendments were urgent and pointed out that without them, we're going to continue to see a grossly disproportionate number of Aboriginal children being taken. And your data proves that. You say you've been implementing some procedural and policy points, but while you've been doing that, it's got worse. Do you accept now you've made the wrong call?
Well, Mr. Shoebridge, I don't consider the establishment of the Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children as a procedural reform. I don't consider the creation of the Aboriginal Knowledge Circle as a merely procedural and non-substantive measure. Now, you may consider that. I'd be interested in you speaking to some of the members of the Aboriginal Knowledge Circle if that's the way that you would like to characterise their work. The department has also put in place an Aboriginal Quality Assurance team to implement the Family's Culture Report. We've also created a new Aboriginal Deputy Secretary to guide the implementation of the report and the closing of the gap targets.
Yeah.
Now, these are all substantive measures, Mr. Shoebridge.
I'll tell you the core substantive measure. The core substantive measure is 43% of the children in out-of-home care are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kids. 16 times more likely to be taken from their home than non-Aboriginal kids. And you tell those families that you've got additional bureaucratic appointments or additional procedures in place. You tell that to the families who've had their kids taken, and they will tell you your government is failing, won't they, Minister?
Well, I think you need to discuss with Professor Davis whether she would consider those 94 of the 125 recommendations of hers that we have either completed or in the process of completing as being unnecessary or insignificant as you described them, or the 97% of the over 3,000 individual case recommendations that she made, which we have already completed. There's been a substantial amount of work done in implementing the recommendations of her report. Is there more to be done? Yes, there is. And are those percentages acceptable? No, they're not. But I don't think that you should. I don't think that you should diminish what the.
I'll take the point of order.
I'll let him finish.
You fire a shot over his bows. He fires back. He's entitled to his full locker to be fired. So you should not interrupt him.
All right. Well, apart from advocating for peace and non-violence, I accept the accept the point. Minister, had you finished?
I think I was saying that there has been substantial work done. I'm not convinced. When you consider that the the government's response was delivered, I think, in the middle of last year. We've had a particularly troubling 12 months, I think we would all agree, and notwithstanding that, many of those recommendations have already been completed, and I think it's now that we would hope to start seeing in the data the positive impacts of those, the implementation of those recommendations.
Minister, what has been the budget allocation to implement family as culture?
I think I'll need to go to Ms. Campbell for the monetary amount. Mr. Shoebridge.
Thank you, Minister. In terms of the funding, we've repurposed a number of resources within DCJ to really focus on what is a key priority for our department in implementing the Family is Culture report.
So what's the budget?
I need to take statistics that come from different parts of DCJ, so I'm happy to take that one on notice.
Minister, what proportion of targeted early intervention service funding is actually provided to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations? So 43% of the kids in out-of-home care are Aboriginal kids, Torres Strait Islander kids. What proportion of early intervention service funding is going to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations? One of the core recommendations of the Family's Culture report.
There's an officer-level working group co-chaired by ABSIC CEO John Lehar and Larry Morgan-Thomas from DCJ, who is in the process of commissioning Aboriginal commissioning projects through the Aboriginal Affairs-led budget. I would need to take on notice the financial magnitude of the Aboriginal early intervention programs that you've asked about.
All right. Well, how much funding has your government allocated to the implementation of the Aboriginal case management policy and, the rules and practice guidance, including in that establishing the Aboriginal community-controlled mechanisms, community facilitators and Aboriginal family-led decision-making, consistent with the recommendations from the Family's Culture report?
Look, I'll defer to Ms. Campbell, but I believe that those matters are working their way through the closing the gap budgetary process for more resources. Many of the departmental resources are obviously dedicated towards servicing Indigenous children.
Well, then what proportion of Aboriginal... So you're going to provide that on notice?
Yes.
Yep. What proportion of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care are in the care of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations then? Again, a core recommendation of the Family's Culture report.
Well, that's certainly a matter that we have been engaging more Aboriginal-controlled organisations to look after Indigenous children and implementing that part of the recommendations. Ms. Campbell may be able to, or Ms. Check can speak to that.
Thanks, Minister. Mr. Shoebridge, I'll give you, if it's okay, a breakdown of where Aboriginal children are placed in the system, which might be helpful. So to your first question, with an Aboriginal NGO, often referred to as an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, at the 30th of June this year, 1406. A non-Aboriginal NGO, 1687, and apologies, I should have given you the percentage. So with an Aboriginal NGO, 1406, which is 20.6%. A non-Aboriginal NGO, 1687, which is 24.7%.
We'll go break.
And then the remainder, 3722, so 54.5, are in the case management or the care of DCJ. There are 14 children where the record doesn't specify their current placement type as well.
We're about to go to morning tea, but I'll just finish this by asking this. Do you seriously believe you're on track to meet your commitment to transition all Aboriginal children in out-of-home care to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations by 2022? You're currently at 20.6%.
It's certainly going to be a huge challenge.
All right, we'll have a short break for 15 minutes and then we will resume questioning.
acting chair for this session, Minister,
Sure.
in the absence of Mr Shoebridge, who is the deputy chair. And Ms Delia, I believe your attendance at the Police and Emergency Services Estimates hearing this afternoon has been resolved, and you'll be
Yes.
in attendance?
Yes, I'll be appearing.
Thank you. Minister, you were asked a question by Mr Shoebridge, I think, about a particular child who'd been in out-of-home care. Was it for 300 plus days?
Yes.
Is that child still in the care of the department?
Yes.
Which town or district is that child located in?
Oh, I'd have to take that question on notice and
Please.
provide that information to the committee.
Okay. Now, I think the evidence earlier given was that 72% of children exit alternative care arrangements within 90 days, which means I think 28% don't. Is that those correct figures?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so with those who do leave the alternative care arrangements, where do they go? Do you keep a track of that?
We do. So they'll exit to a variety of different placement types. So in the first instance, some children will go home, so they'll be restored home if that's safe to do so. Some children will go to a foster placement. Some children will go to residential care. Some children will go to what we call the interim care model, which is another funded emergency model for children who are aged 9 to 14 who have low to medium support needs.
Okay. Could you provide on notice a breakdown?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think 28% don't exit alternative care arrangements within the 90 days. So what are the statistics around those other 28%? How long do they stay in alternative care arrangements, or is it open-ended?
It's a range of periods of time.
Yep.
Mr Searle, a number of these children have very complex needs, and it is difficult to place them, and so sometimes it takes a period of time to arrange the appropriate type of accommodation for them to leave ACA and go into.
Yeah. Could you provide on notice, Minister, or the Department, the breakdown about what happens with the remaining 28%? And also, can you tell us what are the top 5 longest stays for children in alternative care arrangements and which regions?
Sorry, which time frame?
So, say the year to 30 June last year, and then perhaps for the previous year, so we can get a sort of a benchmark on what's happening. Thank you for that. Now, you say there's difficulties in providing placements. That includes foster care placements, is that right?
Yes.
So there's a shortage of foster care placements in New South Wales, I take it?
It's not so much, I'll go to Ms Check, but it's not so much, as I understand it, the shortage of foster parents. It is foster parents who are willing to take these children with some very complex needs. And that's a very particular type of foster parent.
Okay. Well,
that will, take on that. It is a burden over and above a usual foster parent's burden with some of these children, and may require modification to their homes or other matters in advance of them accepting the child too.
Sure. And in terms of modifications, is that something the department funds or supports?
Yes, so there's a couple scenarios that play out. We, depending on where the property is, so if it's for example, the foster carer's own property, we will often make modifications and pay for those modifications. It's different if it's a housing property someone might be living in. Then we go through our good colleagues in Housing and the Land and Housing Corporation to seek funding. But if children need those things, we'll make sure that they happen through whatever means.
Okay, well, just to be clear, Minister, I think you were sort of earlier implying that there isn't a shortage of foster parents per se in New South Wales. Is that correct?
Well, I think I may defer to Ms Check on this, because I think during COVID, the number of foster parents who are willing to come forward and become foster parents did during the most recent lockdown. I think that has declined somewhat, but I'll just defer to Ms Check on that.
So the first statement I'd make in response to that question is we can always, and children can always do with a greater pool of foster carers. And foster carers that can deliver a range of different types of care, from emergency care through to more permanent arrangements, and including where adoption might be in the best interests of children. So we need to replenish the pool of carers that we have available. As the Minister said, both periods of COVID have meant the inquiries of people in the community to become foster carers has been slightly down. The other thing to note, I think, is there's an authorisation process that needs to be gone through any time someone expresses an interest or applies to become a foster carer. That process typically takes between 3 and 6 months to complete, and that sometimes contributes to the delay, if we're talking about kids in ACAs, moving into those foster placements.
Okay. So how many foster parents did we have, say, at 30 June this year?
I might need to defer to my colleague online, Ms Campbell. She may have those numbers with her, if that's okay.
Thanks, Simone. I don't have those.
I can see, Minister, we're back on the information superhighway.
I don't have those specific details. However, I do have information on an organisation that we fund called My Forever Family New South Wales. They, in 2020-21, did recruited and supported carers, conducted 11 carer recruitment campaigns, resulting in referral of about 676 applicants to service providers to further training. And this is actually higher than the 1920 result, which was 556 referrals. As Ms Check alluded to, the process, obviously, once someone's indicated an interest in becoming a carer and an assessment process, and we're working together to look at how we can expedite that process while making sure that we do the right assessments to make sure we get the right sort of carers to support children and young people.
Right.
We can take the question on notice about the number of carers. I understand it's in the vicinity of 14,000, but we can come back with the exact numbers.
So if you could tell us as at 30 June this year and perhaps 30 June last year, so we've got a bit of a benchmark. And the other thing, I think you said that there had been a decrease during the sort of lockdown. Do you have a sort of an appreciation or a sense of by how much it has decreased?
We can take that on notice and provide that to the committee.
Oh, that'd be good. Now, again, I think
I think, sorry, Mr Searle, just to interrupt you, but I think we should just acknowledge the large number of our fellow citizens who are prepared to come forward and be foster parents, because it is, it's a substantial community.
Minister, you didn't hear a word of criticism of them from me or anybody else at this table. We understand that. All right. So I think in answer to some of Mr. Schubert's questions, you were you'd given some figures about out-of-home care. I think in the vicinity of about 16,000. So are they all foster placed?
No.
So what's the breakdown?
I'll just refer to my notes. So I think I said the figure at 30th of June was 15,855.
I think my note was 15,895.
Oh yeah, I'm going on memory, which is not the best thing to do.
15,895.
Yeah, anyway, so around 16,000. So
yes.
Can you give us a sense of the breakdown? How many are foster care? How many are any of them in hotels, or that's alternative care?
Well, they're the ACAs.
They're the alternate care arrangements. So that was the 91 number at the 12th.
Yep.
Of October.
I'll come back to that in a moment. Yes.
Sorry, I'm just checking my notes, and one of my colleagues, Anne, might have it close to hand, but there are about 600 children, and we can again provide this to the committee in residential care. And then there is a split of the remainder across both foster care and relative or kinship care, but we can provide the numbers.
If you could on notice, just provide it like in a table form, that'd be
we can do that.
That'd be very useful, perhaps for 30 June this year, and then for the previous year again, just so we've got an appreciation of what's happening. Minister, earlier this year it was reported in a news report that there was about 70 to 80 children being put up in hotels each night because the department had nowhere else to send them. Was that a correct figure? And has the situation in Orange improved since then? Was that an incorrect report?
I'm not sure of the report that you're referring to. I
might provide it to you later. Then.
The ACA number would include any such children as far as I'm aware, but Ms Check can correct me on that.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that article either, but the 91 number, as you'll appreciate from the evidence that we've given, the children within that cohort change as they exit, as new ones enter.
Okay, is that an aggregate? Sorry to speak over you, but is that an aggregate number? Is that the total number of individuals?
It's a point in time total individuals. So if I use the 12th of October example, there are 91 children, so little people, in those arrangements on the 12th of October.
So some of them, Mr. Searle, sorry to interrupt, some of them, Mr. Searle, will literally be in a situation where on a Friday night they've been removed by their family, no foster parent can be found. They'll have to go into alternate care accommodation for a few days before a foster parent is found, which is suitable for that child. So there can be quite a turnover, and there's a whole range of periods of time in which they remain in ACA.
I appreciate that, and so I guess my question, Minister, is how many children have passed through alternative care arrangements in each of the last 2 financial years? So rather than a sort of a point in time, I just want the total number of persons.
I think we'll need to take that on notice.
Oh, no,
Mr.
that's exactly what I'm expecting.
Yes.
I'm actually seeking information here.
Yep.
We can do that.
That would be very useful.
You're not taking an accusatory approach, is that?
I'm simply asking for a light to be shone on these matters.
Very different.
It's an oral set of interrogatories.
Well, I'm no longer a shadow minister. What can I say? Now, Minister, or whoever is relevant here, which districts have the highest number of children in alternative care arrangements? So I think you've got different districts for your department. You've got, for example, the Central Coast District, Nepean Blue Mountains, southwestern Sydney, western Sydney. So if you could provide the breakdown of, again, when you're providing that volume of children passing through alternative care arrangements, could you do it by region, if that's possible?
We can. So there's 16 districts in New South Wales, and we keep data for each of those districts on a whole range of things, as you'll appreciate, but including alternate care arrangements. So again, we can provide that information to the committee.
Please do. And when you're providing that information, can you also inform us how many of those children are First Nations children?
Of course, we can provide that breakdown.
A number of the committee members here were on that upper house inquiry into First Nations deaths in custody, and this was some of the material that we did.
And remain interested.
And we do remain interested, so we're just sort of wanting to get that information.
Unfulfilled.
I acknowledge that interjection also. Can you tell us what's the average accommodation cost per night for each of those children in alternative care arrangements?
Again,
I'm expecting this will all be on notice, Minister.
Again,
it's not a gotcha moment.
But I must say, Mr. Searle, this is not, if I can say so, it's not a cheap exercise.
I'm not expecting that it would be, Minister.
And that's why it is really a last resort, very much a last resort, not only from the children's point of view, but also from a budgetary point of view. Most importantly, from the children's point of view.
So again, the cost per night, per region perhaps, of each child.
It will be different per region, I would imagine.
I would expect so, and this is why I'm asking for that breakdown, so we can, in the nature of this being budget estimates, to try and understand what those costs are. And also the incidental cost. I assume there are sort of incidentals, which would be, food and other sort of
It's all included in the total price, so we can give you
so there's an amortised
figure,
cost.
and as you've requested, we can do it by district. So that's fine.
Well, give us whatever granularity you have in terms of the information. That would be much appreciated. I'd just like to turn to risk of significant harm reports.
Yes.
The lockdowns have seen fewer interactions between mandatory reporters and children since the lockdown. Is that correct?
There has been a decline in risk of serious harm reports during the lockdown.
Okay. What has been that reduction? Do you have, is it a 10% reduction, 20%? Have you not tabulated that? Again, happy for you to take that on notice so we can get the accurate figures. But, what's today's the 29th of October. Is this, compared to this time last year, for example, is it down?
So like last year in the lockdown, albeit as I think one of the committee members mentioned earlier, it was clearly a much longer lockdown this time round. But we have seen the number of both calls and concern reports coming into the Child Protection Helpline decrease.
Mm-hmm.
And we can directly attribute that to children not being at school.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest decrease in reports has been from the Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
I will find you the decrease from memory. I think in the lockdown period it was about a 17% decrease.
Okay.
Obviously, children have resumed school, and we just in the last 2 weeks, albeit in 2 stages, we are expecting, although I don't have the data yet, a pretty quick bounce back, and that's based on what we saw last year, again after a much shorter lockdown period.
Okay. So
and Mr. Searle, to address this issue, one of the things that I established was a Children's Wellbeing Task Force to look at these issues with regard to child wellbeing, not only in the lockdown but also transitioning out of the lockdown, and that's been a task force which has consisted of people from my department, from health and education, as well as the NGOs who are very active in this space, and they have had 2 working groups. I think they've met 2 or 3 times.
They have.
And they will be giving me recommendations on how to deal with the very sort of issues that I think you may be heading towards.
Thank you. So my understanding is the latest DCJ statistics indicated that there were something like 114,000 risk of serious harm reports in the calendar year 2020, but around 72% of those children weren't seen by anyone from the department. Has that, is that improved in 2021, or has it gotten worse? And again, if you don't have the figures to hand, if you could provide them on notice.
I'll just go to Ms. Check. What I should say though, before Ms. Check goes to the number, is that in terms of actual numbers of children seen, between say 2010 to 2011, when a bit under 13,000 children were seen, we're now getting, the latest figures I've got is for 1920, Ms. Check may have 20 to 21, but we're now seeing over 35,000, so it's almost a 3 times increase in the absolute number of children that are being seen that are the subject of a risk of serious harm report. Now, part of the reason why the percentage of children seen has not matched that huge increase in number is because there has been an increase in reporting.
Sure.
But there's certainly been a substantial increase in the percentage of children seen over the last decade.
And in any case, we'll get those figures on notice.
Yeah, and if I could just add to the Minister's comments, our child protection caseworkers within DCJ have never seen more children than they did last financial year than in any other year.
Mm-hmm.
And quite a significant increase if you look back to even 5 years ago, the numbers of children being seen have increased significantly. There's clearly still more to do.
And in any case, when you provide the figures, we can see all of that.
You can, and if I could just reinforce the Minister's point, it was 36,500 children seen. One of the challenges, which I'm sure the committee's aware of, is the number of risk of significant harm reports coming into the Child Protection Helpline continues to increase. So there was a 17% increase last year, so the total number of reports received, and this data is yet to be published but will be in the next few weeks, was just a tick over 126,000 reports of significant harm.
Okay.
But sorry, Mr. Searle, because it may be of interest on this issue, which is a very important issue, I think, an incredibly important issue. We have a number of initiatives, particularly geared towards bumping that percentage of children seen up. One of which includes a helpline augmentation, which is currently in pilot. Another is actually looking at greater efficiency within the caseworker work to see more children seen. We've got, I think, 2,333 child protection caseworkers in the state, And what we're looking to get out of them is more in terms of children seen.
Just in providing that, could you also indicate whether the percentage of children not seen has also been increasing, or whether that's actually gone down? I understand that when you have more reporting, there's more to do, and maybe you are seeing more, but again, what's the overall percentage?
Yeah, we can provide that. I will just add that there are almost 20,000 children who are reported at risk of significant harm, but where we're unable to provide a face-to-face assessment, but we refer out to a service. So an example might be a referral out to a multi-systemic therapy service. So it's not that those children are not getting a response, it's just not a response in some instances from DCJ caseworkers.
Well, in which case, when you provide the information on notice, if you can indicate how many are just not seen, as opposed to the DCJ interface, that would be useful.
Yeah, we can provide that information.
Because it's really about who gets seen.
Yes, because that percentage of not seen is a little bit misleading for the reason that Ms Check has said, because they are dealt with. It's just not by DCJ, it's by another NGO or other body.
I'd just like to ask about the re-reporting rate. In 18-19, I think it was about nearly 36%. In 19-20, it was nearly 37%. What are the most recent figures you've got for that?
It's just over 40% at the moment, and it has, as you've just referred to, it has gone up. The reasons for it going up have mostly been contributed to a higher volume of reports coming into the system. And what I mean by that is, given there's more reports coming into the system, it's more likely one of those reports will be in what we call the re-report cohort. I think it's important just to take a second to explain the re-report rate is on a particular cohort of children, which the cohort number's about 8,000, and it's children where DCJ have provided a statutory child protection response, and we've subsequently closed the matter after some work, and we've closed under what we call case plan goal achieved, or risk assessment indicates no further intervention is required. It's not the broader system, it's that cohort, on the basis that if we intervene, we mitigate risks, we have safety networks around children, and when we exit, in the following 12 months, children are not re-reported again.
Thank you. Now we move on to crossbench questions. Ms Boyd.
Thank you. And good morning, Minister Henskens. I wanted to ask you some questions in your capacity as the Minister for Disability Services in particular. Firstly, in relation to the National Construction Code minimum accessibility standards, why isn't New South Wales joining the ACT, Victoria, Queensland, Tasmania and the Northern Territory in implementing those standards?
Well, as you'd be aware, that's a matter that falls under Minister Anderson's portfolio. But there was a government decision on that matter, and which predates me becoming the minister, and that was the government's decision. As you'd be aware, when it comes to new social and affordable housing, the standard is the silver standard, I think, in almost all cases. Mr Vivers will correct me if I'm wrong. So the new stock of social and affordable housing that's funded by the government, whether by community housing providers or otherwise, does meet that standard. Mr Vivers, is that correct?
Thank you. I'll just direct the questions to you for now, but I might come back to you, Mr Vivers. I did ask these questions of Minister Anderson as well, so we've been through that, and I understand that there was a prior cabinet decision to not sign on to these standards. What are you doing as the Minister for Disability Services to overturn that decision?
Well, it's a government decision.
You're a member of cabinet, though, are you not?
I am, but I'm not going to discuss what does or doesn't go on in cabinet. That's not
Minister. That wasn't the question. She asked what you were doing as minister.
The purpose of this committee.
Could you tell me what's your personal understanding, so without referring to somebody else, of what these minimum accessibility standards are actually requiring?
Look, I've certainly spoken with disability advocates about this issue. They have explained to me the nature of the silver standards. It relates to as I understand it, whether there's, for example, if it's a multi-level dwelling, whether there's a bathroom, for example, on both levels, door widths and other accessibility issues, whether the bathrooms are configured for full accessibility or not.
So, yeah, that's
in this sort of...
That is partially correct.
Yes.
If I could perhaps help you out. So, because I think it's important to list them because they're so basic. So, at least one level step-free entrance to the building, that the walls around the toilet, shower and bath are reinforced so that in the future they could be retrofitted to be fully accessible bathrooms, a toilet on the ground level, and as you said, having wide enough corridors and doors to get through. Very, very basic stuff. Wouldn't you agree that really that should be the norm for all houses going forward?
Well, I think, Ms. Boyd, as you're aware, there's a significant issue of housing affordability within our community. And certainly we've also got an ageing demographic, which of course some of these measures are of assistance. But not everybody requires these features within their property. So the issue is tailoring tailoring the people who need it to the appropriate accommodation for them. And in terms of the silver standard applying to everybody, that's obviously going to mean that people who don't need those features are going to be getting them and going to be paying for them. So as I understand it, that's the counter argument. I also understand that measures of this kind have never been put in a building code before because the building code specifies minimum standards of construction, and so it's a complex issue.
So, Minister, if I could...
But I must say, obviously, accessibility for people with a disability is an incredibly important issue, which is really the thrust of your question, and which I agree with you. In terms of government-controlled dwellings, social and affordable housing, we are meeting that standard. We are leading the way.
And
many private construction...
We are venturing into the discussion I already had with Minister Anderson. I'm glad that you mentioned that counter-argument about, well, this only is really for a particular group of people and other people shouldn't have to pay for it. Because it highlights, I think, this attitude of the people with disability are one segment, one sort of isolated segment of our community. But, for example, if I don't happen to have a need myself to have wider doorways, for instance, but I have friends who have wheelchairs. Why are we not building houses where any visitor can come with any needs and be able to get through in those houses? Why are we saying these people can only be in these houses that are purpose-built for them, rather than just setting it as the norm for everybody?
I am going to take the point of order. And the point of order is this. Budget estimates has well and truly moved from talking about the budget papers. We've left that years ago. But it actually has to fall within the area of responsibility of the minister. And Ms. Boyd has already identified that she's gone to the relevant minister already, being Minister Anderson, and no doubt received a fulsome and complete answer.
Fulsome and complete being distinct.
Indeed.
The modern
But this is not the minister who's responsible for these matters.
To the point of order.
I appreciate the point of order. I don't uphold the point of order.
All right.
Ms. Boyd will direct her questioning in a focused way.
I will direct my questions
forward.
on disability to the Minister for Disability Services. Thank you.
You're asking about buildings.
No, I'm asking about advocating for people with a disability, and I do appreciate the interference you're running must mean that I'm actually getting good answers here. Thank you.
No, you certainly do not. So please let Ms. Boyd ask her questions.
Okay, so is your evidence here today that you will not be advocating for minimum accessibility standards to be adopted by this government?
It's my evidence that that this is an important issue. Accessibility is an incredibly important issue for the community, and my intergovernment advocacy will be a matter for me rather than this committee.
So moving on to a different topic, do you think that in accordance with our international human rights obligations, our democratic processes should be accessible for all people, including those with a disability?
I think there are many aspects to the importance of accessibility, which includes participation in the democratic process.
Did you intervene when the Premier's office made the decision not to have Auslan interpreters present at press conferences?
There was no decision of that kind at all.
I think you're mistaken, Minister. Do you want to reconsider that answer?
There was no decision. I appeared with the Premier about 2 weeks ago at Redfern to personally inspect the great vaccination work that was being done for public housing tenants in Redfern. And we gave a press conference afterwards, and there were Auslan interpreters at the press conference. There's been no change in policy.
So in case you don't know, so prior to the Premier taking the Premier's role, there were Auslan interpreters present at all of the 11 a.m. press conferences. Since the Premier has taken office, he has confirmed that they will make no commitments to have Auslan interpreters present and instead will just deal with it on a case-by-case basis. Do you think that that is appropriate?
That was always the policy. In fact, the former Premier did away with the 11 o'clock press conferences.
Okay, assuming that that is...
Minister,
Well,
sorry?
Wait a minute.
But then she
Wait a
can...
minute. You can't interrupt. He's answering the question.
Assuming that that was the case, given that we have international human rights obligations to actually provide Auslan interpretation for all political communications, and we fell way behind, don't you think that this is something that we should continue doing?
Ms Boyd, I think you misrepresent both the policy of the former Premier and the policy of the new Premier. Auslan interpreters are available for all major public announcements by the government. They were before the new Premier became the Premier, and they will continue after the current Premier. That does not mean that at every press conference ever given by the Premier or members of the government, there are Auslan interpreters. That's never been actually the policy.
Okay,
And
so let's accept that that's never been.
But the government has a number of accessibility initiatives, which it's always had, with regard to important public announcements. There's a range of them online and otherwise, so that important government messages are accessible to all of the community, because I agree with the thrust of your question, which is accessibility to government information is incredibly important, as is the use of Auslan interpreters. However, they have not always been used at every press conference in the past. They are used when the press conference is making a certain level of public information announcement, and they will continue to be available into the future.
Okay, so we went from a situation where we weren't meeting our human rights obligations to suddenly we were, and everyone thought that was great, to now going back to it being on an ad hoc basis.
I disagree with that characterisation.
Okay, you can disagree all you like.
You clearly haven't accepted what the evidence and the fact is, which is that they weren't always available.
That's right, they weren't accepting.
But they were available for the important public announcements, and they continue to be available for the important public announcements.
Do you think it's acceptable for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing to have to tune in to find out if there's going to be an Auslan interpreter, and then to have to just turn off and perhaps wait to read about it somewhere? Do you think that's appropriate?
Well, it really depends on what you're talking about. I do a range of interviews with the media. I don't have an Auslan interpreter. Ministers have not always had Auslan interpreters with them. I think we've got to be a little bit practical about what are the critical pieces of public communication which we have always and will continue to supply Auslan interpreters for, and what are the more incidental. But then even on the incidental, there's closed captioning on television. There are other there are other methods of ensuring that the communication is accessible.
Are you aware that closed captioning is not the same as Ausland interpretation?
No, I do know that. I'm just saying.
Right.
I was
Okay,
saying that
just
as an
clarifying, because
alternative.
it's a bit of a...
Well, you don't seem to be listening to my answers very well.
I genuinely am going to take the point of order. It's impossible for Hansard to possibly...
You don't need to take the point of order. I understand what the point of order is. On this occasion, both Ms Boyd and the Minister were talking over each other. If they could just
we will endeavour
take
to
it
do
one at
better,
a time, please.
Are you aware that the Andrews government in Victoria has Auslan interpretation at all of their press conferences?
Well, I'm concentrating on what's happening in New South Wales.
Okay, but why is New South Wales so far behind? And you
Look,
don't seem to actually be aware of the facts.
Our disability inclusion plan adopts the human rights, including accessible information for all.
That's lovely that your plan does, but in practice that's not being implemented, is it?
No, it is being implemented.
But you've just told me that you don't intend to have Auslan interpreters at all of the major press conferences.
No, I didn't say that at all. You're misrepresenting what I'm saying.
Okay.
If you want to misrepresent my evidence, then you can keep going
really
on,
don't.
and then maybe you've got something that you can actually
No,
throw at me.
Minister,
but why don't you
please,
just listen to what I'm saying and
Minister,
represent it faithfully?
I do not want to misrepresent you.
Ms Boyd,
you are.
You can ask a question. The Minister will answer. You can then ask another question.
you.
If we can just keep it to that order,
I
please.
don't want to misrepresent you. What I would like you to actually say is that, yes, you understand the importance of this, and of course you will endeavour to do as well as the Andrews government on this, but I'm not hearing that from you, am I? Am I, Minister? I'm not hearing that from you.
There's been no change in the policy. I don't believe that you had a criticism of the policy previously, and the policy hasn't changed.
Okay. Are you aware of how many people in New South Wales are living with disability? Off the top of your head?
Look, there are two categories of people with a disability in New South Wales. There are those with an NDIS plan, and there are those without. What I do know is, in terms of people with an NDIS plan, there are now 80,000 people in New South Wales who are covered under the NDIS.
Yep.
That were never given supports prior to the NDIS. I can tell you that the NDIS, New South Wales was the first jurisdiction to sign up to the NDIS. It probably would never have happened without New South Wales support, and New South Wales committed $3.6 billion this year to the NDIS
with
for
respect,
people
that's
with a
not
disability.
answering my question. My question was off the top of your head, if you knew. And for instance, do you understand the percentage of people on NDIS compared to the people with disability? Do you know how low that is?
Well, there's 150,000 children and adults, I think more than 150,000 children and adults who are being supported by the NDIS in New South Wales.
All right, this is not very helpful. I will tell you, over 1.3 million people in New South Wales are people with a disability. A very, very small percentage, less than 10%, are actually on NDIS. What message do you think that your government is sending to people with a disability at the moment, given your responses both to the Auslan interpretation issue and to the failure to sign on to the minimum construction code standards?
Well, can I just say that the NDIS, if I can start at the beginning of that question, which then seemed to morph into a few other topics, the people who qualify for the NDIS are obviously assessed under federal legislation, which is the NDIS Act, and they're assessed by the NDIA, which is the Commonwealth authority that implements the NDIS. So to the extent that it's not all of the larger group of people with a disability, that was a decision that flows from the federal Labor construction of the NDIS back in, I think it was 2013.
That was not my question, Minister.
What I can say is, just to reiterate, that's still 81,000 more people
Minister,
today
this
getting
is
support
not
than
an
we're
opportunity
getting,
for you to talk about irrelevant issues.
NDIS was instituted. So there's been a substantial increase in support for people with a disability as a consequence of the NDIS.
Minister,
and to
I
try
understand
and
you're new to
suggest-
estimates, but it's
and
not a
to-
chance
and
for
to-
you to grandstand
Boyd,
on a completely
Boyd,
separate
just-
issue.
Well, I think
May
your
not like the
suggestion
minister's answer,
was,
but unfortunately he does get to provide the answer. he
yeah,
wishes.
and I think
Be directly
if-
relevant, though.
If the question
Not
was
here.
worth asking, then
Nice
you
if it
should
was.
listen to the
Boyd,
answer.
we should fix that.
If the question was worth asking, then you should listen to the answer. The premise of your question was that people with a disability in New South Wales were being supported less now than in the past.
Less than before you were minister.
And it's clearly the case that there are 81,000 people now with a disability in New
About
South
the other
Wales
1.2 million, Minister.
who are being provided with supports for the very first time, and that were not being provided with supports before the NDIS.
I would not hang your hat on the NDIS as being a major achievement at this point. My question to you was, what message are you sending to the 1.3 million people in New South Wales with a disability when your government has refused to sign on to the National Construction Code minimum accessibility standards and won't commit to having Auslan interpreters at every press conference?
Well, New South Wales.
I can tell you they're horrified.
New South Wales.
I'm going to take the point of order. Like,
Well,
the minister can, the minister starts to answer, and within 3 words, Ms. Boyd is jumping in again. Like, it just shows a lack of discipline to do it that way.
Yeah.
She asked the question. She should actually allow him to at least start to attempt the answer.
Well, on this occasion, Ms. Boyd actually did. There was actually a very small gap in the minister's speaking, and she filled that. And she filled that gap. But perhaps if the minister would do his very best to more directly answer the questions, perhaps she would exercise more discipline.
Thank you, Chair.
Please proceed.
New South Wales has been a leader in support for people with a disability by its support of the NDIS, by being the first jurisdiction to sign on for the NDIS, by committing substantial financial resources to the NDIS. We have been a substantial advocate for people with a disability in terms of trying to improve the NDIS in terms of its performance.
Minister, the NDIS is not relevant to my question. It is not relevant to my question. The NDIS is not relevant to either Auslan interpretation or minimum accessibility standards. It's irrelevant.
Well, I'll take the point of order. The minister is entitled to answer, and he is
Time is up anyway.
He's able to answer
He's
by
clearly
reference
not.
to other matters that you don't take into account in your question. That doesn't make it irrelevant.
Just shows
and
he doesn't
still
understand.
interrupt. Have a go.
Sadly, time
Time's
for
up.
crossbench questions is up.
Thank you.
I don't uphold the point of order, just for
Doesn't
completeness. Minister,
Yes.
it is a Premier's priority of your government to decrease the proportion of children and young people re-reported at risk of significant harm by 20% by
Yes.
2023.
Yep.
And in my previous questions, the information seems to suggest that the re-reporting rate is in fact trending up. So using your own government's benchmark, don't the recent statistics show that you're failing to protect vulnerable children?
Well, I think Ms. Check already alluded to the response to that question in one of the previous answers that she gave, which is that with an increase in the number of overall reports, it necessarily has an impact on your re-reporting rate, and
Sure.
and that has been part of the issue. Now what
we
we do,
percentage of people who get seen, and
yes, it impacts on the percentage because it's a percentage of a larger number.
yes,
And it impacts on the number that could possibly be re-reported.
Sure, but even allowing for all of that, if the percentage of re-reporting is going up, you're moving further away from your government's own stated goal rather than closer to it, aren't you? You're failing to protect vulnerable children.
Look, what we've got 3 key strategies in this area to address the very issue that you've raised. And this is based on evidence and existing progress that are known to influence re-reports. We're improving assessment of risk of significant harm reports, focusing casework interventions on key areas and ensuring greater assurance on decisions to close cases. And we have a re-reporting task force which is responsible for progressing those initiatives.
Yep. But still, with more re-reports being made and possibly an even higher percentage than before, continuing to go up. That may indicate that, for example, there may be a lack of resourcing for your department. So I'm not being critical of your workers. I'm just trying to get an appreciation of the actual problem, which is the re-reporting rate seems to be on an upward trajectory. And what are you doing to actually try and address that as a government?
Well, we've got the highest number of caseworkers that we've ever had. So I don't think, Mr. Searle, that this is a resourcing issue. No. And I may just throw to Ms. Check to further elaborate.
So, Mr. Searle, you're absolutely right. There's been an upward trend recently in the re-report rate. As I mentioned earlier, just over 40% at the moment. This Premier's priority is a lag indicator, so the re-report rate is from work we did 12 months ago. The strategies that the Minister just briefly mentioned have commenced in the last 12 months, so we've not yet seen the impact of those strategies. However, each of those strategies we have had modelled about what percentage impact they would have against the re-report priority. And based on some other modelling that has happened with our data people, they're usually within 0.5 to 1% accurate of their modelling, so we're quite confident in the modelling of the strategies. What that indicates is by 2023, so 30th of June 2023, when that's the end date for the counting measure for the priority, that we will certainly have a downward trajectory towards target, and very confident in that. I must say, whether we hit 32.3%, which is the target, on the 30th of June 2021, we may not.
2023.
23, sorry. I'm selling myself short by 12 months. We may not, but we are very confident that not only are the strategies the right things to do for children, but we will head towards target. We hope to get there. We may not, but if we don't, we'll just miss, is our prediction.
We'll head towards target. Okay, I understand. Minister, will this remain a priority under the new Premier, under the current Premier?
I can't speak for the Premier.
Well, presumably as part of the government, you'll have input into that process. Do you think it should stay one of the priorities?
I think it's a very important matrix. Whether it is the best matrix, to be honest, I haven't probably been in the portfolio long enough to give you an honest opinion on that. But there may be other better benchmarks, but
you had a rising inflection there, Minister.
But Mr. Searle, you are asking me questions well beyond my pay grade. These are Premier's priorities; they're not the Minister's priorities.
Well, on that happy note,
I'll move on.
Mr. Musselman.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Minister and staff.
See you here, Chair.
Thank you so much. It's still got about 15 minutes.
I've been waiting.
Minister, just listening to the interaction between you and colleague Abigail with regards to the National Construction Code.
Yes.
Why won't you sign up to the National Construction Code, particularly when your federal colleagues have indicated that, have declared their intention to make accessible housing specification mandatory in the National Construction Code?
Well, Mr. Musselman, I'm not sure that I can only refer to my earlier answers. You're really asking me something that I've already explained.
Well, no, I'd like to understand a bit more. What is it that about the National Construction Code that you refuse to accept? Is there any element in it that you do not want to accept in New South Wales, or you won't adopt in New South Wales?
I think I explained to you that social and affordable housing funded by the government is being built to that standard.
What standard?
That I explained to you that there's a... Sorry?
What standard?
To the silver standard. That there is an economic view taken by Minister Anderson within his portfolio where these matters reside.
We're talking about disability services, sir.
Come on, Jack. Let him answer.
He is answering.
That there is a... that notwithstanding what's in the code, there are certainly many privately funded buildings which are built to that code. So there is a movement towards it. Do we need more accessible housing? Yes, I do agree with that. Is going down the code route the only way of achieving that? No, I don't think it is.
Will you adopt any of the national code at all, Minister?
Well, you're really now getting into Minister Anderson's area. I don't know what
I'm
parts
talking
of the
about disability services.
I don't know anything about everything about the building code, and I'm not qualified to answer that question. It's
You're just
outside of my
washing your hands off it
portfolio.
altogether?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't understand what parts of the building code you're expecting me to be answering in respect of do you support any parts of the code?
I'll move on, the Chair. Last question is about disability services, your area, Minister. There are no longer any residents in Stockton Centre, Newcastle, Tomaree Lodge in Port Stephens, Canangra at Morisset, Kenmore at Goulburn, Rydalmere Centre and the Summer Hill Group Home. Is that correct, Minister?
I think the disability homes that you're asking me about relate to Port Stephens, Stockton and Morisset. Is that correct?
Correct. Are there any residents in those?
No, there are not.
Where did they go? Did they go to non-government group homes?
Look, there was this obviously precedes my time as minister, but my understanding was that there was quite an extensive program of relocating the people who were in those homes elsewhere.
Where is elsewhere, Minister?
Well, into other appropriate accommodation.
Are they government or non-government?
I think it was. I think in accordance with the NDIS, they were funded accommodation under the NDIS, and they were dealt with under the NDIS arrangements, which is a Commonwealth manner.
Minister, I wonder if I can assist
Yes.
a little there. The large majority of people went into brand new, newly constructed group homes run by non-government organisations. A small number of them opted for a different arrangement, but the large majority went into group homes built by a consortium called Homes for Life.
My question, Minister, is the government running any more disability services? Are there any more government-run centres?
No, sorry if I may.
Yes, please,
answer.
Mr. Vivas.
No, the government exited as part of the NDIS arrangements from the direct provision of group homes.
They were under federal labour arrangements.
So, what do you do, Minister, in this particular sphere, in this space?
In which space are we talking about, Mr.
Disability services.
Osselman? Yes.
With
well, New South Wales does a number of things. The starting point is that we make a very large financial contribution to the NDIS every year. This year, in the order of $3.6 billion. In addition to that, we fund a number of other services, including advocacy services for people with a disability. Ms. Campbell can probably give greater granularity as to the way in which the remainder of our disability budget is spent, but it is a substantial contribution to supporting people with a disability in New South Wales. Would you like to hear from Ms. Campbell on the detail in answer to that question?
Sure.
Thanks, Minister. As you touched on, we fund what's called the Disability Advocacy Futures Program, up to $13 million in 2021. In response to the New South Wales AGN Disability Commissioner's report on New South Wales advocacy function. We also have engagement and family support teams, and they're funded at $6.3 million this year, $26 million over 4 years, and that's really to assist children and young people in voluntary out-of-home care into the NDIS and to access packages. At the moment, DCJ also funds the Restrictive Practices Authorisation, which is $3.2 million per year to fulfil New South Wales agreed functions under the National Quality Safeguarding Framework. That will, in the future, move across to the Ageing and Disability Commission. In addition to what other roles, we've got a very small disability policy team within DCJ that helps in the negotiations with the Commonwealth and the NDIS, particularly where there may be issues that participants experience. We often step up and provide that support, and certainly Minister Henskens is a very strong advocate at the Commonwealth and with the NDIS in ensuring NDIS participants get access to the scheme.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. I'd like to go back to the Minister and ask questions about the public sector workforce. Minister, in 2019, your government announced a disability employment program, which I quote, aims to increase the number of people with disability employed across the New South Wales public sector from an estimated 2.7% to 5.6% by 2025. I assume you're aware of the plan, Minister?
Yes, I am.
I've seen the Public Service Commission most recent workforce profile from 2020, and the numbers actually have fallen from 2.7 to 2.4. In actual fact, Minister, you're going backwards, aren't you?
Look, Mr Mosselmain, the matters of the public service are actually under Minister Harwin's remit in terms of the management of the public sector workforce. What I can indicate to you is that I agree with you. There is the potential and indeed the necessity for more people with a disability to be employed in the public sector. And there are a range of strategies which Minister Harwell would no doubt be able to inform you about in his budget estimates about those measures. I know that that there are certainly some measures which I intend on having discussions about, which I've become aware of speaking with the sector and speaking with people who are directed towards getting more people with disability in the workforce and in productive areas that best use their abilities, and that's been something which historically I don't think we've done well enough as a community, and I think there's a great opportunity there to do more, and that's one of the issues that I hope to promote more as the Minister.
Well, what do you hope to do more, Minister, given that the statistics shows that you're actually going backwards?
Mr Mosselman, there's evolving understanding and identification of the capacities of people with a disability, particularly neurodiversity and so on, in terms of the sort of roles that they can play in the workforce, and in particularly in the sort of workforce that the public service represents. I think that there are some great opportunities for us to do better in this area, and that's one of the things that I hope to explore in the coming months as the Minister.
Do you have a plan, Minister? Is there a plan put together that you'd like to explore? Is there?
I have a plan in my head. It's not a written plan, but as I've already said, Mr Mosselman, the public service is not, strictly speaking, under my control, so I'm more an advocate in this area rather than a controller.
Well, just on that point, Minister, you're the Minister responsible for the Disability Inclusion Act.
Yes.
And under the principles of that includes enhancing and recognising people's right to participate in economic life. We're talking about employment in the public sector, the biggest employer in New South Wales. We're very interested in what views you've got about how that can be improved.
Well, look, as I've said, Mr Searle, I believe that in the area of neurodiversity, that there are evolving techniques in terms of identifying capacity and matching people with the roles that they can perform within the workforce. And I think we need to use that evolving experience and technology worldwide to ensure that we can get a greater uptake of employment for people with disability. And that's, in broad terms, what I would like to examine at a higher and more detailed level.
Well, could you share with us some of your insights?
Well, I think at a very high level,
It's at such a high level it lacks any kind of specificity, Minister. We'd really like to understand,
Well,
not just you as a minister, but I mean, this is the budget estimates for your portfolio. Your portfolio has an impact on the whole of government. Please tell us what you're going to do to enhance disability participation in economic life in New South Wales specifically.
Well, we have a current disability inclusion plan which we're
just failing.
Adam, he's answering the question.
Well, I'm just helping.
No, everybody.
He's dodging.
I do think the minister is entitled to have his answer dealt with without interruption, if possible. But there's been a bit of to and fro. So, Minister.
Minister,
over to you, sir.
Sorry, I'm just looking at a note. Look, and this may be Ms. Campbell's area, so she may be able to jump in here. But the next disability inclusion plan.
Ms. Campbell's jumped in too early.
Okay, I might go to Ms. Campbell.
Okay.
To talk to this issue.
Sorry for that. I have to unmute and then remute. Thanks, Minister. So people would be aware that this is a Premier's priority and it focuses on three key areas. The first is around recruitment and retention. The second area, and there are a range of activities under that, the leadership awareness and culture change. And the third area is accessible workplaces, systems and tools. As the Minister's indicated, clearly our key focus is also with the New South Wales Disability Inclusion Act, and improving employment participation for people with a disability is a key priority. The Disability Action Plan lists over 100 separate actions to support increased employment for people with disability, and all local councils have disability inclusion action plans aligned with this disability employment priority. There's also a raft of different things occurring. So we've participated, DCJ, in the 2019 Australian Network on Disability Access and Inclusion Index. The final report informed the development of the latest DCJ Disability Inclusion Plan. In 2021, we've worked in partnership with Australian Network on Disability to continue to offer 10 stepping into internships for university students with a disability. We've also successfully maintained the Australian Network on Disability confidence recruiter status across the department, which means that our recruitment and selection practices have been independently validated as accessible and inclusive for people with a disability. There's also a number of career initiatives that are in place to support the advancement of people with disability at DCJ. This includes funding for 3 staff with disability to obtain project management or leadership qualifications to the Australian Institute of Management. I'll probably stop there, but there are a range of initiatives, and also within local councils there are a range of initiatives to really support the employment of people with disability, but particularly looking at employment within the New South Wales government.
Minister, notwithstanding all of that, the plan is actually failing in terms of outputs. What are you as Minister doing, or you as a government doing, to put it back on track so you're actually tracking towards those targets?
Well, look, that's really being led by the Public Service Commission.
So
that
not
work.
my job.
Someone's going to have to teach me how to get the mute.
So my understanding is your answer was not my job. It's the Public Service Commission's job.
certainly.
Pull it out of the wall, I think, by the way.
Minister, to you.
Yes, Mr. Shoebridge.
Had you completed the answers?
I think his answer was, it's not my job.
All right.
He doesn't know anything
I
about it.
don't think that's a correct characterisation, but anyway.
I think it's the only conclusion that can be drawn from that.
Well, I think that round of questioning has now concluded. Minister, you said that 94 of the 125, I think there actually might be 126 recommendations in families culture, but 94 of the recommendations had been wholly or partially implemented. Can you provide either a list sometime today, or if not, as early as possible on notice, those recommendations that have been fully implemented and those recommendations that have been partially implemented?
I think, well, no doubt, Mr. Shoebridge, you've seen the Families Culture Progress Report from May of 2021.
I have.
And that obviously goes through all of the recommendations. We can certainly, I think, in terms of the items that were not completed in May that have now become completed, and therefore there's
if
a
you
new
can give me an
status.
update on the May report is what I'm asking for.
We could give you an update in terms of status, but obviously the items which were completed in May, we won't need to tell you again that they've been completed.
Well, I'm more than happy to rephrase my question. If you could give me an update on the May report, that might be the easiest way of addressing it.
Yes, I don't know how quickly that can be done, whether it can be done today, but we'll do it as quickly as we can, Mr. Shoebridge.
Now, Minister, you the evidence was that only 20.6% of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care are in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. Minister, given the target is to have 100% of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care under the auspices of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, do you accept that you're not on track to meet your target by 2022?
Look, we are certainly, and I think Ms. Campbell will be able to give more detail on this, but we're certainly commissioning more Aboriginal controlled organisations in this space, and she can probably provide more details on the proportion of organisations that are currently providing services.
Minister, 1 in 5 Aboriginal children in out-of-home care in Aboriginal controlled organisations. Your target is to have 100% of children in Aboriginal children in out-of-home care in Aboriginal controlled organisations by 2022. You're not going to meet that target with your current strategies, are you? If you're at 20% today and it's October 2021, you're not on track to meet it.
Well, we're certainly increasing the number. There's certainly some capacity building in terms of organisations that can fulfil that target, which is being worked on. We're certainly diligently working towards the target, Mr. Shoebridge.
Minister, you can't possibly say that. It's almost November 2021. There are 1,600 and... it's almost November 2021. You've still got 80% of Aboriginal kids in out-of-home care being auspiced by non-Aboriginal organisations. You're not even close to the target. And so can you tell me what initiatives or support there is to transition Aboriginal children to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations? How much money are you spending on this?
Well, Mr. I'll go to Ms. Campbell. Mr. Shoebridge, the transition to Aboriginal organisations is not a financial issue because those services are being provided for the Aboriginal children in any event by non-Aboriginal controlled organisations. So this is not a monetary matter. It's a capacity issue, and we are certainly doing what we can to fulfil this this outcome. And I'll just ask Ms. Campbell to elaborate more in terms of your last question in answer to that.
Ms Campbell.
Thanks, Minister. So in terms of transition of Aboriginal children into Aboriginal out-of-home care agencies, we have an initiative called the Aboriginal Growth and Partnerships Project, which is supporting transition and continues to support transition of Aboriginal children to Aboriginal agencies. It's also supporting the establishment of new Aboriginal organisations delivering permanency support programs and expanding the capacity of existing Aboriginal organisations. In the last 24 months, 4 new Aboriginal services have been established in New South Wales. These include the Orange Aboriginal Medical Service in Orange, New South Wales, the Riverina Medical and Dental Aboriginal Corporation in Wagga Wagga, the Wingalilli Aboriginal Child and Family Centre in Gunnedah, and the Narang Virong in Western Sydney. In terms of, we've funded ABSEC for an Aboriginal Growth and Partnerships project. That amount was $1.21 million over 2 years until the 30th of June 2022. We've also provided funding to ABSEC of about $1.5 million for strengthening supports in Western and Far West projects to really establish more Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and Western and Far Western New South Wales. So there is a plan underway, and we're certainly working in partnership with ABSEC and other key agencies to actively increase the number of Aboriginal controlled organisations supporting Aboriginal children.
So, Minister, in the last 24 months, the success, if we can call it that, has been the establishment of two new Aboriginal controlled organisations to deal with out-of-home care. 2. You're not going to pretend that's success, are you?
Well, Mr Shoebridge, we're not there yet, but as Ms Campbell has explained, there is a process that we are working through to get more Aboriginal controlled organisations working in this space.
2 in 2 years. You're not going to pretend that's success, are you, Minister?
Well, the response to the FIC report was the middle of last year.
Yes.
So
you may have achieved none in the last 12 months.
Well, no, I'm just saying that.
All right. Well,
I'm not sure.
Okay. 43% of the children in out-of-home care are Aboriginal kids.
Yep.
And the only funding commitment that I heard Ms Campbell speak to in terms of resourcing and creating Aboriginal controlled organisations was, being generous here, a combined $2.7 million to ABSEC, which is 0.1% of your $2.4 billion budget. That's embarrassing, Minister, isn't it? That's insulting and embarrassing. In fact,
Mr Shoebridge, I am having a little bit of a difficulty understanding. If the government creates organisations, then they're not an Aboriginal controlled organisation, obviously. So the money is there to fund Aboriginal organisations to provide these services. It's a transition that has to take place with the Indigenous community to get these organisations created and operating to provide the services. This is a partnership.
Minister, it's a partnership.
Mr Shoebridge, and as you would understand, it's not easy to provide services at the levels required for appropriate levels of child protection quickly. It needs to be done methodically and properly, and of course that will ensure the best outcome for Indigenous children.
Minister, at the rate your department is moving, an entire generation of Aboriginal kids, or 80% of them, who are put in out-of-home care, are going to continue going through a system where they're not in the care of Aboriginal controlled organisations, continue to fail as identified in the Family as Culture report, and continue what on any question is sort of the ongoing stolen generations. That's what you're on track to do, isn't it?
Well, I don't agree with that.
Well, Minister,
I don't agree with that because
you've got $2.7 million at most.
Mr. Huberidge.
I'm going to take the point of order. I know you're chair. You put a proposition, ask him to either agree or disagree, and then when he seeks to answer, you speak over the top of him. Now, that cannot be appropriate. The Minister is entitled to answer the question.
Indeed. Minister.
Mr. Huberidge, I agree with the outcome that we want all the Aboriginal... We want out-of-home care for Indigenous children being provided by Aboriginal controlled organisations. I agree with that outcome. However, I don't accept that the fact that 80% are not in that environment means that they are a stolen generation, or that there is not still a recognition of the culturally appropriate ways in which to provide their out-of-home care. Because within the department, there's a huge focus on ensuring that people are put in appropriate, culturally appropriate environments. And I think the proposition that you were putting to me doesn't fully take into account that reality.
Well, Minister, I don't understand what that reality is in a system where Aboriginal kids make up at most 4% of the children in the state, and yet make up 43% of the children being removed from culture and country and families under the system under your protection. I don't understand how the department's working.
That is an acceptable
I don't understand
outcome.
how it's
and I wasn't
culturally appropriate.
That proposition does not deal with the answer that I just gave.
All right.
Does it? It doesn't.
Well, Minister, why don't you answer this question? What proportion of Aboriginal children and young people in out-of-home care have a documented cultural care plan?
I'll go to Ms. Check on that.
So at the 30th of June 2021, for those Aboriginal children in statutory out-of-home care, 60.3% had an approved cultural support plan, which is 4.3 percentage points higher than what it was in June 2020. So clearly more work to do. It's certainly nowhere near the 100%. So we are investing in a range of learning and development initiatives, both for caseworkers within DCJ, but within the NGO sector as well as rolling out Aboriginal cultural capability training.
And who did the cultural care plan for the 60% of Aboriginal kids who have it? How many of those were done by the Department of Communities and Justice and non-Aboriginal NGOs, and how many were actually done by culturally informed, culturally engaged Aboriginal community-controlled organisations?
Can I just interject before Ms. Check answers that question, and to say that we do have Indigenous people working for the department, and we do have Indigenous people working in non-Indigenous controlled NGOs. And your question or proposition doesn't seem to recognise that reality.
Mr. Shoebridge, if I could just respond to your question in terms of responsibility or who completes the cultural case plan. That will depend on who's got case management of the child. So in New South Wales, that can be DCJ, it can be an NGO. Then the completion, as I said, is the responsibility of who has case management of that child. What we do in DCJ is actually consult with Aboriginal staff. We sometimes will lean on ABSEC or contract ABSEC to support us in the completion of those cultural care plans, or other independent bodies and Aboriginal organisations that are in the community. I can't speak on behalf of the NGO sector, but I understand it is similar. And just a final point, the issue of culture, the important issue of culture, is one of the standards that the New South Wales Children's Guardian requires of all designated agencies that deliver statutory out-of-home care, and they do have a monitoring function around cultural care planning, along with a whole range of other standards.
And you'd be aware that Richard Weston has been appointed the Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children, with oversight of that within the Office of Children's Guardian.
Minister, what are the reporting mechanisms for non-Aboriginal organisations that receive allocated Aboriginal funding in your department?
That's an incredibly broad question, Mr. Shoebridge. I might ask Ms. Campbell if she could begin to understand.
Well, maybe you could put it in
directed.
Ms. Campbell.
Sorry, it was a bit unclear about the question, Mr. Shoebridge. Could you just repeat that for me?
Well, as you know, when a non-Aboriginal organisation has the responsibility for in out-of-home care looking after Aboriginal children, there's funding for cultural care plans, there's funding specifically associated because the child in their care is an Aboriginal child. What are the reporting mechanisms so as we can have some transparency on how that funding that's meant to be allocated for Aboriginal cultural connections, what's the transparency so we know where that money's going?
Yes. So within DCJ, we have local and central contract managers who monitor what's in the contract and what's meant to be delivered. In addition to that, there's also the Office of the Children's Guardian, who clearly has a role in oversight of NGOs in complying with the standards around Aboriginal cultural care planning.
All right. Well, Minister, what has your department achieved under the Closing the Gap Priority Reform 2, which, just to assist, is building the Aboriginal community-controlled sector? Is it the 4 organisations over 2 years? Is that it?
Well, that closing the cap target is obviously broader than just my portfolio. And Minister Harwin is the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and responsible for the closing of the gap targets. But as you're aware from one of my earlier answers, we have created an Aboriginal Knowledge Circle. We have the Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children. We have within the department an Aboriginal Outcomes Task Force. We have an Aboriginal Quality Assurance Team. We have a range of measures within the department which are geared towards the closing of the gap target. And we've now employed a new Deputy Secretary who is an Aboriginal gentleman who is the current CEO of Legal Aid, who will come in to oversight this within my department.
Minister,
that's a very high level.
Every single thing you just referenced were resources inside the department, which is 100% contrary to what that priority is about. That priority isn't about building the department, it's about building Aboriginal community-controlled sector. Everything you've just put on the record is 100% contrary to that. So can I ask you about the Aboriginal community-controlled sector?
I wonder if I might give a very practical example of what we're doing. We are in the process of transferring 1,500 properties from government control to the control of Aboriginal community housing providers. We started that process this year. So far, 500 properties have been transferred to 4 Aboriginal community housing, Aboriginal controlled organisations, and the remaining 1,000 are in the process of tenders being invited from Aboriginal controlled organisations. So that's a very practical example of moving resources from government control to the control of Aboriginal organisations.
Thank you, Mr. Vivers. Are there any other practical examples you can give, Minister?
Ms. Campbell is responsible for the closing of the gap target, so I wonder if she might elaborate further.
Thanks, Minister. And I'll just touch on other programs, we've only talked about 4 Aboriginal out-of-home care providers, but there is also within the early intervention, youth and volunteering, there are 44 Aboriginal organisations across 3 program areas, so Family Connect and Support, supporting families into early childhood education and targeted early intervention. Within family preservation and child protection, there are 56, so 20% Aboriginal providers. This includes Aboriginal controlled health organisations, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal organisations, partnerships, and Aboriginal sole traders engaged to convene family group conferencing and dispute resolution. Within the specialist homelessness sector, we've acknowledged that there needs to be a significant increase in the number of Aboriginal controlled organisations. We're currently in the process of about to go out to tender in 4 locations for Aboriginal specific services. Under the Together Home program that Mr Vivers and the Minister have talked about, we recognise that of those particular packages that were available, there needed to be 30%, but we also acknowledged that we needed to identify an Aboriginal service provider to actually manage that program, and there's been the first one that commenced earlier this year on the Central Coast, which was part of a co-design that happened with the Aboriginal community up there, and we've now got new people moving into that program. So there's just a few examples. Thanks, Minister.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. And on that last example, Mr Chair, the Central Coast organisation who was dealing with the Together Home program was particularly, Aboriginal organisation, controlled organisation, was particularly effective. And that organisation is now mentoring other Aboriginal controlled organisations to also get involved in the Together Home program and other locations around the state. So this is, Mr Shoebridge, this is an evolving and a building engagement of more Aboriginal controlled organisations, and I'm confident that we are heading in the right direction on this matter.
Right. And Minister, on notice, you might just indicate what of the $2.4 billion of the budget has gone to Aboriginal controlled organisations. If you could provide that on notice, that would be appreciated. And if you could compare that to the last financial year, that would also be appreciated. Would you mind taking those on notice?
Sure.
Ms Jackson?
Just in the few minutes that's remaining.
So where are we in terms
Just the last
Jackson's going to take us out.
I assume Mr Vivers has this, but Minister, you might. The current social housing waiting list.
Mr Vivers, I think you've got that number probably at hand.
So the waiting list is published for the end of June each financial year. There were 46,087, so this is June 2020 because the 2021 list is not yet published. 46,087 people on the general list and 5,308 on the priority list.
When we're going to get the 2021, because it's now obviously almost November.
Yep, it is published in November each year. There is a process that we go through to eliminate people who have tragically passed away, for example, or people who indicate they're no longer in need of being on the waiting list. We go through that process in order to publish an accurate number, and that just takes some time to go through.
And do you know how many of those people are women over 55?
We would know that. I don't know that right now. I'd need to take that on notice. I will take it on notice.
Thank you. Minister, I think Ms Campbell was earlier trying to answer the question to say that there are no specialist homelessness services that are dedicated to women over 55. As you probably know, that's the fastest growing group of homeless in New South Wales. Are there any dedicated strategies that the government has to address that?
Well, we certainly, in terms of the priority group, we certainly have priority for access to social housing to most vulnerable groups of people.
But as you hopefully know, the age cutoff for priority access is 80. So if your only vulnerability is age, you're not eligible for priority access until you're 80.
Well, we also have a number of other categories for priority housing, which includes domestic violence victims and the like. For Aboriginal people, it's actually 55, not 80. And there are a range of other. Mr. Vivas is more expert on these matters than I am, but there's a range of disability is another area. There are a range of different criteria which give people priority to the priority rating.
Are you aware, though, of this issue that I'm raising, which is an increasing number of women who aren't otherwise eligible for priority access, but are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness because they have limited superannuation, there's a marriage breakdown, there's an illness, something happens. These women are currently ending up in places like boarding houses and other relatively inappropriate locations for women over 55. Are you doing anything about that?
Look, it's an important issue. Certainly you'll be aware, I know we'll cover some of these women but not all of them, but you'll be aware of the almost $500 million announcement we made with regard to domestic violence supports and the core and cluster augmentation in up to 75 different localities across the state. And so we are certainly sensitive. Now, I know that you're not talking about all people who are surviving domestic violence. I know that you're talking about a broader cohort. I might just go to Mr. Vivas if I can.
Can I say we're absolutely aware of that cohort of people, and so are our staff, and we make our staff aware of it. The priority housing, the age limit that you refer to is not actually for priority housing. That is for people who are on the general waiting list. If they reach the age of 80, they do get a priority. That's not priority. It's an in-between priority.
That's right, priority A and priority B.
Yes.
We discussed before, yes.
But the process of assessing people is a very individualised process, and it's actually a very thorough process, and we look at everybody case by case. But I absolutely do agree that we need to make the staff who are undertaking those assessments aware of the needs of particular cohorts, which we do, and that does form part of our training of staff.
And can I just add, I think, two things to that. The first is that if somebody is at risk of homelessness, then that gives them priority, I believe. Mr. Vivas will correct me if I'm incorrect. And the second matter is that our support for the vulnerable in terms of housing is not limited to the provision of a social housing property. And indeed, I think Mr. Vivas can give you the figures on the number of people that are helped in the private rental market through our rent choice programs, which we have announced 2 lots of $10 million upgrades in recent months to support people in the private rental market who can't otherwise get a social housing property. I think Mr. Vivas can speak to the number of people that are assisted in that way.
Yeah, if I could give you some sense, around about 10,000 people come in each year to social housing. That's all forms of social housing. We assist 16,700 people to enter into the private rental market. And that's either financial assistance or we help them actually find a place in the private rental market.
Oh, I think I've run out of time.
You have.
You have run out of time. So now we now have the government has an opportunity to ask any clarifying questions? No. Minister, thank you for your attendance today and to all the bureaucrats. I just want to particularly thank Ms Campbell and Mr O'Reilly. It has been difficult, I know, from your end to contribute, and we appreciate your ongoing efforts.
We can do Parliament.
And Ms Delia, we look forward to seeing you at 2:00.
Thank you.